And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I hope someone gets my message in a bottle.
What message is that?
Well, there's a few tonight, but a year has passed since I wrote my note. It's very, very interesting. There's so many things we're going to get into tonight with this very special live stream. And this is the Deep State Election X 2024 UFOs, COG, the Trump indictment, and the JFK assassination 60th anniversary with the records locked up and why. We're going to get into what really is behind this huge thread that takes us through the UFO file and the governing structure. And it leads us all the way from Eisenhower right up to the present day and the committee that's running Biden, who's acting more and more bizarre, in fact, so that it's a daily occurrence. But what they're trying to do is, they're hoping to just roll the corpse of Joe Biden across the finish line on November 6th and 2024. And instead, they're getting some real, and I mean some hardcore pushback with the polls showing that Donald Trump is leading Stepford Biden by 6 points, which is a lot considering that tight split, but it's not a lot considering the kind of strange polling that gets done that tends to favor Democrats. But if the Democrats are actually down on their own polls, that's not looking too good. So we're going to get into that tonight and the deep state interference from the continuity of government side. This goes deep. And we're going to have to get into the deep state wayfarers tonight, along with the people who've really opened that up, including Professor Peter Dale Scott and Joseph Farrell gets quoted tonight. I don't know if is Joseph out there in the chat?
He's with us.
Well, he's got to get quoted later tonight. And we have some fantastic kind of opening up of some things, including some things you may not have known about Gorbachev and how that relates to all this. So we're going to be going deep on all that tonight. I want to remind everyone that we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And Miss Olivia is going to be putting all those questions together so you can ask them anytime. And I guess before we go any further, Miss Olivia, why don't you tell us the temperature out there?
Well, everyone wants to talk about Maui. So Karen Carpenter says, DJ's take on the Maui fire and prearranged move towards Smart City AI Island?
No question. And we're going to have to separate out a lot of the wheat from the chaff there because there's a lot of both. But, these things are happening. And tonight I have some very interesting information, which dates back to when the United States government went on the record about using weather modification. Of course, LBJ himself in 1962, when he was just vice president, before he assumed the presidency after John F. Kennedy's assassination, gave this major speech about whoever controls the weather controls the world, talking all about these weapons. In 1997, I have the quotes tonight from Defense Secretary William Cohen, the Republican who was working for Democrat Bill Clinton. And I think he slipped up rather dramatically in letting the world know that these weapons existed, including earthquake making weapons and hurricane weapons, weather modification. And there's no question that they've used these for a long time. The question is their goal in using them now. Well, we've seen all the wildfires in Canada and the terrible things that are happening there and the terrible things razed to the ground in Maui. There's been a lot of warnings along the way from people like Lana Freeland, for example, who've given us real in-depth studies about geoengineering and the types of things that could be done. And of course, you're going to get into situations where some natural disasters will occur. There's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be fires, and it's going to be the way that that is managed also. It doesn't always have to be they're causing it. It can also be in the stand down orders, like the guy who was fired for not letting the alarms go off. I mean, a 5-year-old kid knows enough to hit the alarm when the fire hits, right? So the idea that this guy was like, well, I was new at the job, wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. And so there's enough stories like that to show that something very, very unusual was going on. And I'd like to see some really hardcore analysis around the physical aspects of it. We know that in certain fires that happened, for example, in California a few years ago, there were actual embers that were, aimed in particular directions and headed in certain places. So those are directed energy weapons. There's no question that we have those and they exist. Who's operating them and what are their purposes? These would be the real questions. And also, how much of it is the orchestrated side versus piggybacking on a natural disaster? That's the way we're going to kind of get through that. And it comes right in the middle of these indictments of former President Trump, which I find interesting also with Hurricane Hillary
Mm-hmm.
coming up the California coast. That's a weird one. They could have called it Hurricane anything. But I think on the week, that Trump gets indicted and then they have Hillary taking a bow on MSNBC, in that kind of sick criminal Clinton gang way. And then, to see that and then them calling this Hurricane Hillary, these are the types of messages I think that the sick leadership is operating with. And there's no question that the natural disasters and their outcome are highly suspect, especially when you get prime areas where you have World Economic Forum control, like Canada. Anything that Trudeau does is suspect. And until the people of Canada boot him out, and I think that they're getting ready to do that, you're going to have him participating in all these things. The thing that he participated in earlier in the year was the phony UFO shoot down with the continuity of government people here. So that tells us a lot already that they've been testing out a number of different scenarios. The UFO file comes up very significantly tonight as the story of the UFO whistleblower David Grush continues to fall apart and his own background spills out. This was a controlled operation put forward by the intelligence community and the CIA taking the lead on all of it. And I think that people who are in the UFO field need to be more outspoken about the CIA coming in and invading the field the way that they are. The only way to push it back, of course, we've done plenty of that on this show. But I honestly, I'm seeing a kind of a critical opening here with the collapse of the Grush operation. And the word is now, and I've gotten this from three pretty deep contacts. One of them telling me that they're going to replace Grush in the fall with someone whose initials are JS. And this is who we're looking for, the replacement switch out man, because the Grush op is failing badly with the revelations of his time spent in a psychiatric facility, which weren't on record in his interview with Russ Coulthard. And Coulthard, the Australian journalist, quote unquote, continuing to make, a fool out of himself with this whole thing and pretending. And remember, this is a lot of the things that happen here are very orchestrated. And their new thing is, I think they did a lot of polling and realized, well, people don't want to buy a CIA UFO narrative. So now they're having the CIA people say that, oh, we're against that CIA. And, the CIA set us up when they are CIA. And that's true with Grush. Grush at the NRO and the NGA, his trainers and all those people, the entire agency, his actually direct trainer was a CIA lead person, and the person representing him legally as his lawyer and at the hearings was Charles McCullough the third. And McCullough, is responsible for working with Cheney on the Patriot Act. He worked in his own bio now. In his own bio, if you search just a half inch deep, you're going to find him working with the setup of Homeland Security. So we see where a lot of these guys are coming from. So we need to keep that in mind when you're getting the UFO part thrown in here, that it's orchestrated by the same people who brought you the Patriot Act, TSA, all the Bush era restrictions, and the entirely kind of anti-constitutional moves in the wake of 9/11, which again remains largely unsolved. And the answers that they've given for it are worse than the answers they've given on the Kennedy assassination. Those deep events are interesting. We're going to follow that thread tonight. And it's interesting because Professor Scott who's done outstanding work, and we've quoted him and had him on the show many, many times. I've had many conversations with him, and I've worked with his research for years. One of the key things that he spotlights is that era all the way from the Kennedy assassination to 9/11, using the continuity of government people for it and using these systems. And when you stretch that system that he has out, of course, he doesn't deal with extraterrestrials or anything like that. But if you extend that into the UFO file and go from the 9/11 attacks to 2023, you're going to find the financial coup d'etat in the middle of all that, Ukraine war, and then the UFO file, the COVID op. All of this stuff is, if you follow that chain that he laid out from 63 to 2001, then you bring in the Trump aspect. So, with Space Force and the attempt to regain the UFO file, that is what the heart of the battle that you're seeing so many of on the political side going through. That's why you have the insane situation in this country of a former president with 4 indictments and supposedly another one to come. Have you heard about this Arizona one? There's number 5 is on the way. So don't worry, Trump. You're going to be in the spotlight nonstop because these crazy people want to put you in jail. And beyond that, they're now having fantasies on MSNBC, and they have whole shows where they sit around dreaming about Trump in prison. And in one of the shows, it was pointed out by Jonathan Turley, who I think does really excellent legal analysis. I knew he was good years ago when he came out and stood up for the workers of Area 51 who couldn't get any relief for being exposed to chemicals because technically they didn't exist. And he went to bat for that. And if you go into his history, so Turley has been around, and he knows a deep state operation when he sees one. He has sliced and diced all the different indictments, being no fan of Trump either. But he sliced and diced all the indictments and say they're completely hollow. And what they're trying to do is criminalize free speech, and in particular, election speech, campaign speech. And that's the most dangerous thing, I think, that they're working with in the ramp up to 2024 under the guise of Jack Smith. Jack Smith spent all this time in the Netherlands being groomed to take on these UN cases, didn't spend a lot of time on U.S. soil, and very, very strange character with a losing record when it comes to prosecutions. So it makes you wonder why they would choose him to go after this. A lot of the notes in his background have judges going, this guy patched together this thing and this thing. These theories don't work. I've never heard of this. This is the kind of stuff he does. So they throw him in as a kind of a weird spoiler. And, just like the whole Georgia indictment, we've got a weird, weird case with 19 different people and all this stuff. So literally the legal experts on this who are doing commentary are saying, this is basically, what is the name of that painter who throws everything at the wall?
Jackson Pollock.
Jackson Pollock. This is like a Jackson Pollock case. It's just like throw everything, splatter it there, and call it a case. And all of these guys, on some level, they all have different classified records. They all have this, they all have that. And no president has ever been indicted or put in prison at all. And you've had some who are, in very deep situations like Nixon and Clinton and others, and so the impeachment and all this type of stuff, it's just becoming a way of life for the people who are in the leadership right now. It's win at any price and bring in this new system at any price, because they can't get to the total control of the central bank digital currency, the biometric monitoring surveillance system, and you being a cog in this wheel without getting rid of the whole populist movement. So anyone who's standing in the way, including Trump, and he in particular, this is what a lot of people are not aware of. And this is what we bring forward on this program in terms of his actual background, which is very, very closely connected to, I'm not going to say the mafia, of course it is, but it's very closely connected to aerospace. This is the key that links together the Reagan era, the Trump era, and the Kennedy era, and the thread of all of those, because you have an out of control industry in aerospace connected directly. That's a major aspect of the deep state. We're going to get into that tonight. Before we go any further, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter. That keeps us in touch through the kind of laughable censorship that we go through, but we keep showing up on every social media network we can get our hands on. And you guys keep finding us somehow. But with the newsletter, it's easy because you'll get that once a week. It'll let you know the incredible, and I mean remarkable shows that we have coming up for you, along with amazing interviews. And just wait for the stuff that's coming up for you later in August and into September. And then the return of the X series after Labor Day, documentaries, events, all kinds of stuff, all there in that newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for it, and, stand up and be counted in relation to that. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, and deliver my message in a bottle to Elon Musk, of all people, what do you got?
Dean Tant says, why did Trump's lawyers tell him not to hold his talk on Monday? What was he going to say? And Corey Evans says, did you see Trump spilling the beans, or do you see Trump spilling the beans, even if it's only a partial spill on what he knows about UFOs, advanced tech, whatever Tucker inevitably interviews him?
No, this was a good move. First of all, there was no reason for him to prove, if they had a case against him, there's no reason for him to go on TV and prove anything. That was just an impulse thing on his part, saying like, I'll get you with a press conference. But his lawyers don't want him to do that because, he's presumed innocent after all. He's the person that they're accusing of all this stuff, and the state needs to prove their case, which they can't legitimately. So this is the weirdness of this case. And they've made it a RICO case because those are easy cases to prove, but they are also, according to a number of legal experts I've been listening to, including Judge Napolitano, the easiest to unravel. So they want an indictment against him. They figure that'll saddle him for the 2024 election. But I think that bet is wrong, and they keep doubling down whenever they see the data is not taking him down. They keep saying, let's find a case in Arizona to take him down on that. And it's becoming so crazy and out of control that it may actually destroy their entire operation because you become too exposed trying to go after somebody and it becomes obvious. So, they're not working, the Get Trump thing, which has been on since 2016, is not working. So they have a number of cases, but he's riding high in the polls. He's going to take the Republican nomination. And, they're going to have Stepford Biden standing up there. So there's a lot of interesting things to get into around these cases, though. Before we do that, I want to deliver this message directly to Elon Musk, who made some changes to X today. And one of them was that you can't block anybody anymore. But, that's one of the most ridiculous things in the world. And some of his other changes also quite absurd. They have this lawful but awful list who's going to be demoted. Well, anyone that they don't agree with will fall into the lawful but awful category. So that doesn't make any sense. And that's the kind of censorship that he supposedly was brought in to get rid of. And he's bringing some of that back. So that's not a good sign in terms of our friend Elon. But I have a direct message for Elon, which is, there's a lot of blogs circulating right now, and I've heard this behind the scenes for a couple of months, that they are moving like Amazon is moving into their own, Amazon does their own movies and stuff. Well, these guys are moving into their own programming. And that one of the things that our friend Musk wants to do is something called the X series. I kid you not. And it's supposed to cover all the media stuff and all the rest of it. Look, I want to deliver this message on tap. This is almost 6 years that we've been doing the X series. You're not going to introduce a program on Twitter called the X series. You heard it here first. That's legal notice for Elon Musk. It's not going to happen. And if you go to do that, I am going to employ the fastest, faster than your head can spin, the New York law firm who handles my intellectual property. And that's going to be the end of any idea of the X series on Twitter. So in case anyone hadn't told you about that, Elon, you got it there first. So, no X series for Elon. We've exposed enough of the X steganography to show what he's about, and they're not going to take the name X series. It's not going to happen. So they're on record, right? Or we're on record, I guess.
I'm sort of dreading this.
Hey, listen, that's fast life in the big city, as they say. But no, we're not going to allow that to happen. And I will take every ounce of resources that we have to make sure that they don't recreate the X series as some phony Elon Musk, freedom fighter nonsense. The X series is this series that we're doing here, and we've been doing it long enough. Okay, and there's a reason also why they don't want the real piece of the X out there. They like to say, "Well, we're just doing the X Everything app and X technology, and geez, everything X is going on." Well, we've described the X steganography before and how it relates to advanced technology. Someone, we've heard these different things about how I've read this before where they say, well, Dark Journalist, he says that X steganography is related to advanced technology, but then sometimes he says it's related to psychic phenomena. The X steganography, if you follow the show, and you've got something like 200 episodes there, it takes us all into the mystery school aspect, and it's readopted in the 20th century to hide the advanced technology right up through today. So that's what the X steganography piece is all about. And there's no question SpaceX, X.com, the X Everything app, all this stuff is all related. And, DARPA and those types of forces working with Musk are working to bring in some of that breakaway technology they've been hoarding over the past 80 years at least. And so here we find ourselves with them talking very openly about X. But the problem is when they go to move this out into the public, their arrogance has taken over, and they've been signaling each other with the steganography. And I'm not sure really on their side what they think about, somebody is actually reading the steganography out there. But I do feel like some of these moves are like, well, we'll make it blatant ourselves because it's the cat's out of the bag. So that's some of the weirdness that's going on in relation to the show and the things that Twitter into X have become. So we're going into some wild territory on this, and you guys will be the first to hear of anything going on there. Okay, so Elon's on notice. Let's take a little walk back in time, shall we? People in this photograph: John Connally, who was in the assassination car with President Kennedy; Donald Trump; Richard Nixon. This is a fundraiser that took place in the late 80s. And Trump, in fact, spent a great deal of time setting it up for Connally with Nixon. And Nixon wanted to put this together. There's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that we've laid out in relation to Trump and Nixon. But suffice to say that Nixon knew a great deal about the inner workings of the government, having been president, vice president, senator, etc. Then from jumping in on the UFO file side, Nixon had a great deal of knowledge. He was one of the most informed on that front because he worked under Eisenhower. And if you go into the good research around the UFO file, you're going to find Nixon running something called CIA Blue Book, which is the real Blue Book, and the public got the phony Project Blue Book. They're like, oh, look, it's a balloon. But real Blue Book dealt with, the actual source material, crashes, bodies, advanced technology, everything. And so he had that knowledge going in, and there's a number of stories, which we've all heard, about him at times showing off crafts and bodies to his friends like Bob Hope and Jackie Gleason. That's a weird thing that Jackie Gleason made a flying saucer house, but now I found out that Bob Hope had a flying saucer house. It's getting weirder all the time. What about Bing Crosby? So when we look at that, we see a thread there of these people. And when you get into that presidential position, I remember Stanton Friedman telling me about bumping into Jimmy Carter at Logan Airport here with no security or anything. And he was on his way out of here. And so he walks up to Jimmy Carter and he says, I'm Stanton Friedman. I'm a UFO researcher. And, I would like to hear everything about the UFO file. And Carter said, I would like to have seen everything about the UFO file too. They wouldn't let me see it. So they said they were going to, and I never got a shot at it. This is the position that an out of the loop president gets into when they get in there. One of the big problems, I would say, in 3 different presidencies is the level of knowledge around the UFO file. Those 3 presidencies are Kennedy, Nixon, and Trump. And then Reagan, there's also a sideshow with Reagan's knowledge around the UFO file and his collaborating with Gorbachev. And Gorbachev comes in very, very strongly tonight. But when we get into looking at the multiple indictments after a former president and the unprecedented nature of it, I want to use the UFO file as the solution for the thing that they're doing and the advanced exotic technology that it represents for the smokescreen that the CIA is putting out around the phony UFO whistleblower garage. I want to thread these things together so that we understand them as one package. So that's what we're going to get into tonight. It's great to have so many of you here with us. This is the Dark Journalist Special Report, USA versus the Deep State, Election X 2024. Of course, RFK Jr. is in the middle of this as well, and UFOs and the continuity of government program. So let's crisscross the present with the past to get us into a likely future. RFK Jr. is running for president. He's the son of Robert F. Kennedy Sr., who was assassinated in California in 1968 on his way to becoming the president. And of course, famously was the attorney general in his brother John F. Kennedy's administration. And he was the senator from New York. Now, RFK Jr. made a very interesting public tweet recently. And he says, President Biden's illegal refusal to release the JFK assassination records and his reckless escalations in Ukraine remind us of New Orleans DA Jim Garrison's singularly insightful quote from his book, Heritage of Stone. Now, of course, Garrison, the DA who investigated the Kennedy case and found all sorts of CIA connections directly involved. And something that I've spotlighted is that he found all of these aerospace connections. That's crucial, and we're going to see exactly why. Here's the quote that Kennedy put out there that Jim Garrison wrote in the Heritage of Stone book. Until the work of the Kennedy assassins is undone, presidents will come and go, but the warfare machine with its extensive intelligence tentacles, domestic as well as foreign, will remain in control. The assassination reduced the President of the United States to a transient official, a servant of the warfare conglomerate. His assignment is to speak as often as possible about the nation's desire for peace while he serves as a business agent with Congress for the military and their hardware manufacturers, basically the military-industrial complex. Garrison gave us that information and was the only person to bring a charge in the case for the assassination of President Kennedy against Clay Shaw in 1967. That went to trial in 69, and of course, the jury let Shaw go very quickly. Now, interestingly enough, Garrison, in his going through this case and the number of people that he interrogated, he kept coming up with aerospace people and didn't always know what to make of it. But there were aerospace people like Boeing people and people from Lockheed Martin. These are the same people who are making incredible gravy train money in Ukraine today. We need to thread those things together, and we need to understand the level and the involvement of the aerospace companies in the rollout of this technology and the interface of those aerospace companies in that strange corridor between advanced technology and the intelligence community. So you have the CIA putting these people out with false UFO stories, and then whenever you get in there, and they're they are colonels and other people, but a lot of the people that they rolled out there are hand-selected CIA agents over and over again. We pointed it out in TTSA, Lou Elizondo, Crush, and all the rest of it. We have got to penetrate that operation in relation to the presidential campaign of 2024, because these things are coming together and history is really colliding in one big boost. And RFK Jr. putting those pieces together and quoting Garrison is making him public enemy number one for these people, let me tell you, because they don't want a Kennedy back in the White House, first of all. Second of all, they certainly don't want him. And third, they know very well as soon as he gets into that office, all the records open up and expose what's going on in the deep state. And you might say, for somebody who has just come across this show or this type of thinking, for them to say, well, the Kennedy assassination, that's 60 years, come November. What could be in those records that could do anything, Well, let's turn the question around a little bit. Why wouldn't they release them? So we've seen that people who've encountered the records have said, oh my God, you can't let that out. And we put on the record that conversation that took place between Judge Napolitano and President Trump, which was an obscure little thing that Napolitano mentioned about a year and a half ago. We really made hay out of it on this show. And now he talks about it all the time. And I'm so glad, because it's a very important piece of history that was just hanging out there about this conversation with President Trump. And, famously, Trump was supposed to release the JFK records October 26, 2017, required by law. The entire government was supposed to put those files out. And Mike Pompeo, CIA director, comes in and says, you can't release them. And this is why. You're going to expose all these people. Now, Pompeo later will go on the John Stossel show. This is kind of famous clip out there that we've put up. And he's sitting there and he's talking a mile a minute, And Stossel says, look, it's 60 years. What's going on here? Why don't you let the records out? Well, why didn't you let those records out? And he says, well, there's still people that could be hurt by that. And, we know it's best kept in the vault, this kind of stuff. And then he says, by the way, I know about the UFO file too. And, we have bigger fish to fry too. So right in his head, that moment when he talks about the JFK assassination files that the CIA is holding back. By the way, that's the main agency holding files back at this point. And the records that they're holding are very interesting, including the Garrison records and the records of their operative, George Joannides, who set up the entire Oswald project, but was also associated with aerospace activities. So they get to this point, and he's just sort of blathering on, and that crisscross there again around the JFK assassination and the UFO file. That's what was on his mind. It's like a subliminal slip of the first order. And it's a crucial piece that there's something in those records that opens up the story about JFK and the UFO file and the CIA's justification for participating in his murder, which is that he was going to share their most vital secret with the Russians. And we know that story we put on the record from the Watergate lawyer. None of ufology is interested in anything of substance. So, you have this Watergate lawyer, an actual historical figure, not a fly-by-night colonel being propped up by Lou Elizondo, saying that the top CIA person said JFK was assassinated over the UFO file. Well, that's pretty important. But this is the nature of how we need to navigate this. So not only is it the mainstream media, but it is the independent world, the people who do the UFO file and stuff. They need to be part of this other machine. They're also funded by intelligence work. So we need to go to a totally different place when it comes to this type of reporting. So let's go into some of those places here. Now, I'm known to have some interesting pictures at times. Check a look at this picture. That is Trump talking to Gorbachev in 1987. It's funny, too, because it's not easy to get. And also, there's a number of blogs and things and websites that talk all about how this person dressed up as Gorbachev to meet Trump and did this whole thing at Trump Tower. It's a totally different incident. And Trump met with Gorbachev, not just at the United Nations here, but on a number of occasions. So here we have Trump operating on a very early level with the head of the Soviet Union. Later, you're going to find Trump trying to work out very specific deals with Putin, and the State Department, the American media, everyone, the whole world, hitting the roof, trying to say, oh, there's Russian collusion and all that craziness. What was it that they were trying to prevent? Well, Gorbachev himself may give us the answer. In an interview that I found with him, it's just a short little interview, but it is oh so enlightening. And I want to say this about Gorbachev as we're looking at President Trump and his difficulties. He seemed to understand exactly what the deep state was up to. By the way, I found this interesting that, Twitter, which gave Jack Smith access to all of Trump's private direct messages and his entire Twitter account without telling Trump. And they could have made hay out of that. This is under Elon's rule as well. So it's very suspect action. But what they were doing, and they did it in the Georgia case, Trump's tweets count as overt acts in the Georgia case. That's an actual quote from one of these. So now the whole thing about criminalizing speech, right? Well, hey, start with the president, work your way down to the regular people. So Trump saying things and tweeting things out, if they can get a prosecution, it's going to be, I have to watch what I tweet from now on. I might end up in some case, This is the nature, the chilling effect that they're trying to do. It is censorship overload and something we have never seen in America on this level. And it has to be watched incredibly closely and pushed back immediately. It cannot be allowed to become part of our national discourse, freezing political speech. Absolutely ridiculous. Now, Trump and Gorbachev. Let's keep this in mind. Trump and Gorbachev. All right, Trump and Gorbachev. Trump and Putin. Trump and Putin. Kennedy and Khrushchev. There was a lot of disputes there because Kennedy didn't want a translator in the room at first. He didn't want any State Department officials. Trump didn't want any State Department officials or intelligence people around his meetings. Reagan didn't. Reagan, as a matter of fact, when he was in Reykjavik with Gorbachev, took off with him. And Reagan cornered him, as Gorbachev told the world in 2009 on Charlie Rose, and freaked everybody out in that press hall that they were in New York, and said, oh yeah, Reagan said, if there's an alien threat, an alien attack, are you going to help us? And Gorbachev said he was absolutely dead serious. Gorbachev put that on the record also for a reason. When we look at these individuals and the things that they were dealing with on the UFO file, they both have a problem to manage, which is there's their international relations, nuclear weapons, and things of that nature. And what happens in 1987 is Gorbachev and Reagan propose the zero option. The zero option is no nuclear weapons at all, anywhere. This is a kind of a confidence thing that they thought we can bring the world into this. We have this advanced technology. Let's tell the whole world about it. It didn't work out because the SDI Star Wars thing, the Pentagon, etc., and the CIA were involved in squelching any deals like that. But I found a very interesting interview, as I said, with Gorbachev. I've been listening to a lot of his stuff because I think he left a lot on the record. I want to point this out. Gorbachev went and gave a speech at the Texas School Book Depository. I've mentioned that before, but it's crucial for us to understand in the light of this tonight, because when you think about the whole idea of symbolism, as leaders know, for him even to go to the Texas School Book Depository, let alone give any kind of address there, is just phenomenal. And one of the things that he said was that President Kennedy was so far ahead of his time that he was basically, we're still catching up to his vision. And that was in 2010. So it's quite remarkable. I'm going to read a couple of things here from Gorbachev before I go any further. Miss Olivia, Europe.
Karen Carpenter says, our history is just tragic. That is my feeling that I keep having.
Our history is tragic?
That our history is just tragic. The more you find out, the more you learn. Oh, God. We realize things could have been another way, should have been another way.
Oh, my goodness.
A better way.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the battles that we're having right now should have actually been fought in the 1960s. And they got a lot of things caught up. There was a whole thing after the fact of the 1960s because there were advances that were made. But then, you'd have a lot of these shows on PBS and they were like, we have done so much. And, they would ignore the fact that there was a civil war that took place between the deep state and the regular, overt state. And that, guess what? The deep state won. They assassinated the leaders that were causing change and they were able to move forward and go on with their agenda, the Vietnam War and all these other things. So that's a very large thing to leave out. But they wanted people to exist in a weird state of like, oh, we've done all this stuff, I think the way to look at it is there were some victories in the 60s, but gigantic setbacks, that are rippling through our national security reality now. And the fabric of American society is just off the charts. All right, back to Gorbachev. When Putin set up his first meeting with Trump, Gorbachev came out very quickly and said Gorbachev compares Putin-Trump meeting with his meeting with Reagan. That's very significant because the meeting that Gorbachev had with Reagan was the first time that they had come together since Reagan had been in office. Reagan had gone through 3 different Soviet leaders that he didn't meet, and the world was on the brink of nuclear destruction, as it is now over in Ukraine war with Russia. So this fascinating and short article, he says some fascinating things. Watch what he has to say about this. Ex-president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, compared the meeting between Russia and U.S. leaders Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump at the G20 summit in Hamburg to his meeting with ex-president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. The politician made such a statement in an interview with Italian publicist Casia, Giletto Casia, posted on the Globalist portal on Saturday. Quote, I recall when we started the disarmament dialogue with Ronald Reagan, I was told in several days after the first contacts that U.S. naval vessels had entered the Black Sea and approached territorial waters of the Soviet Union. I was asked, what shall we do? I understood immediately that this was a provocation. Someone in the Pentagon did not want this dialogue. This is a very canny observation on his part, but he's watching something. The deep state is moving, trying to stop this situation from happening between Gorbachev and Reagan. One, a lot of people would say, well, they wanted to keep nuclear superiority or all the rest of it. But if he's talking about 0 options, that means they're talking about rolling out the real technology. Apparently, the nuclear technology is very antiquated, and it was in 1987. How antiquated is it now? Very destructive, unfortunately. Handshaking between Putin and Trump is a positive signal, Gorbachev said. This opportunity should not be missed. It will be a challenging thing, but this meeting is very important. It may become a starting point to deliver results that seem to be unachievable now. This was the faith that Gorbachev had in the whole situation. That was somebody on the inside who knew a great deal about the American deep state and the Russian government, having led it through the most tumultuous time of all, Glasnost and all the rest of it. So for him to go on the record and say this gives us that insight there that something was trying to sabotage this peace summit, these peace meetings, this idea that we'll go into space together. Now here, if you roll back the clock a little bit, you're going to find us in the Kennedy era. And Kennedy goes and he meets Khrushchev. And, Khrushchev actually, when they have the first meeting, swears at him and does all this stuff that's very anti-diplomatic. And he's yelling his head off. And Kennedy is turning to his advisors and saying, what's going on here? It's getting strange. So, but Kennedy holds his fire back. He does not engage as a matter of fact, he compliments Khrushchev about the Russians and fighting in World War II. And he goes on the record in his speech at American University in June of '63 before he's assassinated saying, look, the Russians really won World War II and they suffered the most. And, they deserve our respect for that. And this was unheard of because all the American propaganda was, no, those terrible Russians now, when they used to be our allies. This is the whole 1984 thing. Oh no, now we're allies with Oceania. But what happened was Kennedy, by taking this approach, said, "Look, it's actually in your best interest because of our incredible nuclear arsenal and yours that we just kind of work together on these things." And he starts to actually convince Khrushchev, who is really hardcore. But Kennedy takes him into his confidence and says, "I want to work these things out." And for a while, Khrushchev continues the saber rattling and all the rest of it. But after a while, he starts to really respect him and say, like, I have this guy coming in was a playboy and, was a typical capitalist looking down his nose at us. But I realized just, he's trying to really work with us. So they devised together a joint mission to the moon. And this is anathema to the deep state. So here they are getting together. Now, when they get together, the CIA is livid because they want people in the room. And this is an early thing with JFK getting the sense of somebody is trying to really dime in to his operations here, and he needs his own channel. So what he does is he develops a network of journalists to carry his messages around the State Department and around the CIA and around the government directly to Khrushchev. And so somebody picks up a newspaper in Washington, D.C. It's got a message from President Kennedy in it. That person goes overseas. They meet with somebody in Berlin. They drop the newspaper. The other person picks it up. Those people head off to Moscow. Khrushchev opens it. It's got the code that Kennedy said would be in there. He reads it. He understands it's the message. This is how they communicated. And Kennedy realized you need this. You need this because otherwise, not only can everything be exploited, but also any plan that you have will be surveilled and thwarted, especially related to very secret technology projects, and the UFO file especially. So towards the ends of Kennedy's life, before the assassination, he is approaching the CIA and saying, "I want all the high threat cases related to UFOs, anything that we've chased, anything that's been around in nuclear facilities, we're going to share them with the Russians. And also, we have a new outer space policy, which was announced on November 12th. It's 10 days before the assassination. And those papers, the outer space cooperation papers with the Soviet Union, are still at the JFK library. You can read them. And the other memos to the CIA have been knocking around for years. And so the CIA has never denied any of that stuff. They've never touched it, in fact, interestingly enough. So what's gone on there, that tug of war is a very important piece because in about 10 years, Nixon will weave in language very much like Kennedy was trying to get out of the CIA to give to the Soviets. He'll weave the language into the SALT II treaties. And it's interesting in the SALT treaties, these are the strategic arms limitations treaties. They're the original talks that get set up by Nixon. And then the SALT II comes later with the Carter thing. And that's all looked at later as, it's weakness and everything else. But in fact, it's an idea towards limiting weapons. And Reagan, although he comes in as kind of a hawk and all the rest of it, he realizes that he's being played at a certain point, and he works directly with his counterpart Gorbachev. But he's not just working with him on nuclear reductions. He gets the first real nuclear reductions, which I think is phenomenal. And he's the one who really lowers the nuclear tensions after being laid out as somebody who's really, this incredible, and Reagan's a fascinating subject that I have coming up in another episode. But Reagan and Gorbachev do something very important, and it's on the record, which is they talk about, with no translators, with no State Department people, nothing. They talk about the UFO file. And what happens is Gorbachev says in 2009, Reagan laid this on me about the UFO threat, and he wanted to know that we would do this together. Now, that's what he was able to say publicly. Now, let's look at something else in relation to Gorbachev. Gorbachev has a very strong connection with the Kennedys. Meets Jackie O on numerous occasions, talks to JFK Jr. He's aware that Kennedy was eliminated and that Khrushchev was attempting to work with Kennedy to go to the moon together, to call off the space race and all the rest of it. So they're all aware of this other thing that's functioning to thwart that. Then if you take this mentality and you move it into Trump and Putin, and you think about all the ridiculous things that we got, Russian collusion, $50 million for this ridiculous investigation into Trump over it, it all starts to make sense as you're in the middle of this swamp of the X technology and keeping it in certain hands. Whenever you get these two people at the top of Russia and America talking, you can crisscross the UFO file, and those people that are holding that technology get very, very nervous because these people have a counter structure, which, after all, as presidents, they can pull that UFO power back underneath their own umbrella. President Trump introduces the Space Force. I'm sure Putin has a very tight handle on his own UFO file. And I think that the UFO file in Russia during the fall of the Soviet Union became an object of desire for the American government, in that was one of the things that we were thwarted on. And so that they're very concerned now when somebody like Putin is sitting at the table and they're on the same type of level. So there's a lot of espionage related to the UFO file that goes on. It's not talked about at all. But of course, if you had advanced technology studies in one country and in another, and they were very close, just like the atomic bomb, you'd have tons of UFO spies. So, we need to keep this in mind. There's a whole process going on in relation to this. So when we see the phony, Grush and Elizondo and that whole CIA swamp, Jim Semivan, this incredibly a career officer in the intelligence, in the CIA at the top level, 25 years, coming out and being like, I'm a contactee and I'm going to bring you UFO disclosure. I don't know. I mean, the entire field of UFO research needs an overhaul to the UFO file, and forget about the CIA circus stuff. Obviously, that's a circus. It doesn't have anything to do with reality. So let's now take that and extrapolate it out into the situation that Trump finds himself in now. That's going to give us the key with RFK Jr., Trump, and Stepford Biden for the 2024 election, and anyone else who's waiting in the wings. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. This is the Deep State versus the USA, Election X 2024, UFOs and COG. X is the word that you've heard. And Miss Olivia, before I go any further, what do you got?
David Tormina says, DJ, Russ Coldhart has recently pointed to the aerospace connections with the UFO file. How do you think they might attempt to manipulate this history by discrediting it by association?
Yeah, that's a good point, which is I'm going to use myself as an example. And, this doesn't mean that the work that I do goes to my head, because trust me, it does not. But let's say that the things that we've laid out in this series, for example, the CIA manipulation of the UFO file, the deeper research around it, the Kennedy part. These people on the inside are looking at somebody like me and they're saying, well, how do we get around that? Because, we have this whole thing where the CIA isn't trusted. Largely, if you do polls about the CIA, a lot of people are very aware that they were responsible for President Kennedy's assassination. So at the same time, they need the CIA network to bring forward the UFO file because they don't trust anybody else. And so it needs to be under CIA control, even if you're using NGA or something like that. There was some researcher who was like, this isn't CIA, it's NGA. Well, when the people who are training the NGA people like Grush or CIA, how often are they using him on CIA missions? They said this about Elizondo, and they were like, well, he said he worked for the CIA for 2 decades, but he was actually DIA. You don't understand how intelligence agencies work. Look, if you are working for the Central Intelligence Agency for 2 decades, you're a Central Intelligence Agency officer. That's the way it works. And, they have agents, and there's a lot of interfacing, whether it's the NSA, the CIA, and they do have their turf wars and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, if you have somebody like Elizondo who's working for DIA and CIA for 20 years, he's part of the CIA UFO op. I mean, it's pretty obvious. There's no sense in splitting that up. And it's funny because these guys don't even lie about it. This is the amazing thing about the recent operations, let's say since 2016. CIA used to put people in place and like, here's this journalist. Nobody knows if the CIA is funding them or whatever. These people are like, yeah, I've been in the CIA for 25 years. I was in their top counter intel. That means I'm the best liar on the planet. And I'm the one who's going to give you UFO disclosure. So there's a kind of weird, I don't want to call it psychosis. There's a weird thing in the UFO field. It's like it was so beaten down for so many years that when this thing comes along and it's like, hey, look, we're the CIA, we're doing documentaries and stuff. Come on, we'll show you in the skiff all the secrets. They all run over a cliff, and that's the end of that. It kind of doesn't matter because that end of the field was never very impressive anyway. However, the subject is very, very important. And I think some really good people have been able to do the real research on it. The field, kind of useless, and I've been around it a lot. I've known the best and top people in it. And I can tell you there's some real gems in it, but the field as a field is kind of a big zero because they don't understand deep state. They don't understand the deep state. Actually, if they all took a course from Peter Dale Scott and the deep state, and then combine that with their UFO research, the whole field would transform in a very short period of time. This is the crucial aspect, which is you have to understand how the government operates in order to understand the UFO file. There's no question about it. All right, let's go a little bit deeper. Since I've mentioned this, a couple of sort of slight things I want to show came up here. So someone mentioned Russ Colhart there. This is the guy who brought forward the Grush thing and News Nation. Now, News Nation, this is funny. News Nation is run by Nexstar, which I reported here a few weeks ago, and I went through the different things that Nexstar had as holdings, including The Hill and all these other things. And suddenly you saw all these media holdings that they had doing all of these UFO things, including KLAS, which is the station that does Mystery Wire and all the stuff with George Knapp in Las Vegas. So those are the people behind News Nation. They collaborate with Chris Cuomo, who was a CNN reject and all this stuff. You're not going to get any truth from somebody like that. So they started to be part of this thing, pumping up Grush and that whole thing before it exploded and he was revealed. Now, along the way, a few interesting things happened. So there's a guy named Steve Bassett. A lot of people know he did the Disclosure Project, and they did an interesting job. I think it's 2013, where they put together an entire congressional style committee. They hired out ex-Congress people, and they did it. They ran the whole thing like a committee. So now Bassett was going to be on News Nation, and he, goes out there in his social media and he says, hey, I'm going to be on News Nation. They're going to give me an interview. Now, this is very important. This is his own tweet. I'm just going to read it straight up. Please do not overreact to this post, he says, which is basically an FYI. News Nation is lapping the field in the UAP disclosure process. I love and support News Nation. Last Thursday, I perhaps unwisely announced to social media I was asked to appear on News Nation, Banfield, Friday night. My slot was soon canceled. And I have subsequently learned certain members of the inner circle contacted News Nation and persuaded it to cancel my appearance as I was not competent to speak on the subject, unlike them. Inner circle. Corbell, Colthart, Knapp, they're in touch with News Nation. They're saying, don't have this guy on. We're the ones, but what's interesting to me is they're saying he's not competent to speak on this subject.
Competence.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? This guy's been in there 3 decades doing his own thing about UFOs, etc.
Passionately.
But the CIA needs this op. They don't need former ops. They'll take collaborators. They'll try to roll everyone into their enchilada, false disclosure enchilada. So what he says is, I'm not surprised at this, nor are my feelings hurt. The issue is breaking and things are going to become intense and competitive. That said, I feel that those who have supported me many years should be informed of such incidents. So that's Steve Bassett going on the record. But you see, and he did it very much in a gentlemanly fashion, you can see here what he's saying, basically. I announced that I'm going to be on News Nation. The inner circle the Corbells and those, Coltart and that whole clan, they go to News Nation. Don't let him on. We're the ones, we've got the Grush Circus. You can't do that. And so now that's public. Now you're going to see more of this, back and forth about how it's set up. And what's interesting is that David Fravor, they had this other Navy pilot who wanted to come forward, and Fravor, who's one of the, witnesses who came forward, and I believe his testimony that he saw UFOs when he was out there in a training exercise. God knows what the military was throwing at him. But anyway, he says about this guy, oh, he's just in it for the money and attention. He's not a real whistleblower and all the rest of it. So this is how it's going to be. It's like there has to be this one particular track. And if you bring in these other people, or if somebody has a real history in the thing, forget it. They're out. They might want actual disclosure. Watch out for that. So the CIA knows the people that they can manage. And so this is not only is that the kind of contemptuous actions of a marketing group and the whole circus thing that, with Corbell is just awful. It's one of the worst things in the show called Weaponized. What could be worse of a thing to put in a show about UFOs? The exact opposite. You don't want them to weaponize UFOs. You don't want an alien threat. Only the CIA wants junk like that. So this is where we get to, in this field, and it has to be pointed out. And remember this, the person who is, I pointed this out again, this is Charles McCullough III. He's responsible for what? Working with Cheney on what? The Patriot Act. That's in his bio. He is responsible for working for the setup of what? The Department of Homeland Security. Yeah, how does it feel to be, sort of encumbered by 250,000 agents of Homeland Security, infringing on your freedom, who have no constitutional right at all to be doing what they're doing? That whole thing, this guy was involved directly with Bush and Cheney in setting it up. That's Charles McCullough. And on the DNI website, there he is with his mentor. Guess who his mentor is? James Clapper. All right. And I know, we've talked about that thing about how there was somebody who looked like Clapper at the hearing, but this is him. Clapper's his mentor. For real. That's on the DNA website. They don't deny that. And so, that's who is working Grush through the system. That's why this is false UFO disclosure. Do you see who's operating here? They're trying to take the UFO file and use it for things like the Patriot Act. That's the UFO threat, the CIA UFO threat aspect. And that's where you get into emergency powers and the whole continuity of government piece. That's where the crisscross of the UFO file together with this understanding of the deep state brings us to a totally different place, because right now you have a lot of people who are very good on the deep state side. They understand government assassinations. They go through all these different things, but they don't know or care anything about the UFO field because it's been such a circus. And then on the other side, the UFO circus, they are played by the CIA, they are marginalized and all the rest of it. But they have one great advantage. They know about the UFO file. They know that there's a UFO file to be dealt with, and it's a huge issue. So it's in the crisscross of that. And in the work that we're doing on this show, and you can find it in the work of people that we have on this show, like Gigi Young, and others, that bringing those aspects together, really brings us into a totally different space in understanding that. Now, one final piece about this, which is in the Washington Post. This guy, Will Sommer, who was always big on, everything is a Q thing, and like how terrible Trump conspiracy. Oh, we need to stop, people from being able to talk about these things. One of my least favorite journalists of all time. However, here he is reporting on the Grush story and saying, you know what? For cable news, the UFO story has ratings payoff and reporting pitfalls. The fledgling cable channel News Nation found a viewership niche in the murky claims of alien visitors, but also had to run some corrections. And let me tell you, the corrections they had to run were hilarious. And they did terrible research and reporting on all this. But that is a story in there. And they use people like Greenwald from the Black Vault in that story. I will tell you, it's hilarious the way that they do this. But look at how the maneuvering goes from the CIA side. They can set up their own fluff characters like the News Nation thing, Cold Heart, and all the rest of it, and Grush. And then they roll them out. And whenever they get into trouble, those people are able to go, hey, it's CIA doing it. Look, the CIA is doing a hit piece on us. Because they realize that if they don't appear as whistleblowers, if they don't appear as the injured party, the victims, and they can say, hey, that government needs to give us that truth about the UFO file, that's the position that the public wants, right? The only problem is these are CIA people who are doing it. So it's the government pretending that they are whistleblowers. These are just government people. That's the nature of the thing. What do you got?
Do you think, I wanted to know, do you think people are sophisticated enough at this point to see through this?
Well, I think if they, like in the ideas room, yes. But in the general public, it gets murky because sometimes you'll see people say, oh, good, somebody came out, about the UFO file. Good. The government's going to give us transparency on that. But when it's a government operation to give you the UFO file, that's not the UFO file. That's the problem. And that's the thing that we're dealing with in this situation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the Dark Journalist Special Report, USA versus the Deep State Election 2024 X, UFOs and COG. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And we're going to go for about another hour here. That sounds about right, Miss Olivia. And before we go any further, what's the temperature?
I don't have a lot of questions for you right now.
Okay, good. Good. You can ask your questions all along the way as we do this presentation, and in the second half, at the end, the last half hour, we'll take your questions. Okay, a little more here on Trump and the indictment. And I think that the Trump-Putin thing, Reagan-Gorbachev thing, Kennedy-Khrushchev thing, it's becoming obvious that when they're trying to collaborate and work together on that higher level, create their own networks for communication, they get thwarted by something. That is the deep state aspect we're working with. When you get around the UFO file, the group that's operative in thwarting it is X-Protect. That's the group that we identify is directly sitting in the intelligence wing of the aerospace side. That's the thing that's unrevealed. And that's why I believe in the JFK records, the problem is if you open up the JFK records that they've kept, there's some sort of booby trap that I believe Bobby Kennedy left in there originally. And I went back through the story. If you go into it, it's unusual because Bobby has the CIA director, McCone, at the time. It's not Dulles because Kennedy had fired him. So he has McCone come out and he says, you have to come to my farm in West Virginia now. And right after the assassination. And he comes there and they have a 3-hour meeting. Now, it's never discussed exactly what took place there. But one of the things that Kennedy's aide said is that Kennedy asks how many CIA people were involved. That's his first question for McCone. Now, a tape came out recently, which is very interesting, which is President Kennedy talking to Robert Kennedy in 1963, talking about what a bastard McCone is. And that's pretty interesting because not a lot of people have known. They knew about the tensions between Dulles and Kennedy, and that Dulles said, that SOB Kennedy, he thought he was a god. I'm glad he's dead, and all that kind of stuff to an aide when he was drinking with his aide in 1967. That story comes back to us. So this is how these people think about him. We've spent all these years putting the world together, and here's this guy, this great looking movie star type guy, and he's smarter, and he's got, he's not beholden to us because he has his own money, and he has this idea of world freedom. He thinks he's a god, we'll take him down. And what happens is, and what's fascinating, I think, in the reading this out, is a lot of people have always wondered about McCone. And he's the sitting director when Kennedy is assassinated, but he's brought in from a kind of financial circles. And he's not the true insider. But it's interesting, he's nowhere near the insider that Dulles is, and everyone who is kind of aware on the intelligence side understands that Dulles never really left his position of being director, even though Kennedy fired him. So that CIA history lingers. And it brings us, you go from Dulles and McCone to Helms. And then Helms famously sits down. We just got a tape out from Jefferson Morley last year. And Morley does all these great things going through the old records. And it's very funny because, we talk a lot about presidential records, and there's this whole case against Trump. Oh, he kept the records at Mar-a-Lago. And, the key thing is, look, the Nixon tapes themselves are still the subject of a court case between the Nixon family and the government. And so the idea that, the government's entitled to all these records and things, how long has Nixon been out of office? 50 years. So, think about this really. Clinton left with 5 million records. Obama has so many records. We all know that Pence left with records. Biden left with records, So the Mar-a-Lago raid, the staging on the top of it was, oh, he's taken classified documents. No, he can, of course, declassify them as president, and he can take any document that he wants. So, there's never been a question about that. And when it came up in a case with Clinton, the judge was like, he can, he's the president. He can have any of the documents that he wants. So there's already precedent for it. Here's the thing that I think is so compelling around this. Nixon, if you go back 50 years in that whole situation, when the government goes, we want this tape, we want that tape, and they finally get one, very often it's the government themselves who black things out because they don't want it out. So it's not so much that, oh, the government's fighting hard for transparency by getting those Nixon tapes. No, they don't want something to spill out that's in the private vault of the Nixon family that could make them look bad, like the Kennedy assassination, the UFO file. Need I go further? The Apollo moon missions, and things of this nature. I thoroughly think we went to the moon, but there's a lot of hanky-panky involved. So, we need to look at this from this type of an angle, which is the government doesn't want to give you any transparency. The CIA is the last agency in the world that would give anyone transparency for anything. As a matter of fact, I have a number of reports on the record of Mike Pompeo planning Julian Assange's assassination and Trump stopping it. All right, that's what the CIA is about. They're about assassinations, counter intel, lying. They think that they have this job. And Harry Truman, who, went along with their creation, he came out a month after the Kennedy assassination and said, look, they were never meant for this. I didn't create them for this. And I think that, unless the whole thing is reformed, we should get rid of them. And he faced his own intimidation as a result of that. And famously, very interestingly, Truman is heard to have said to Allen Dulles, who flew down immediately, even though he was the retired director, to make him recant. Truman said, you can't do anything. I'm old. There's nothing you can do to me. So what's interesting is on the record, too, is that Dulles went from that point, and he went and it's hilarious, which is he wrote this whole thing saying that he staged this whole phony interview where he said that Harry Truman had lost his marbles because he was old. So that's the nature of the Central Intelligence Agency. So the quote, if we go back just briefly again, now I'm going to go back to Gorbachev to bring us up to date to election 2024. So stay with me on this. All right, from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. This is the quote now from Gorbachev to Charlie Rose. From the fireside house, President Reagan suddenly said to me, what would you do if the United States were suddenly attacked by aliens from outer space? Would you help us? I said, no doubt about it. He said, we would too. Help you, that is. Reagan, when he came back to America after having done this, repeated the story to a group of Maryland high school students. So there, 2009, Gorbachev puts it on the record, but Reagan repeated it. And here's a very interesting follow-up on this, a very obscure little detail. Upon his return, he gives this speech to a group of Maryland high school students. Deputy National Security Advisor Colin Powell, Deputy National Security Advisor Colin Powell, used to go through the president's speeches and remove mentions of what he called the little green men. Think about that. So Colin Powell is going to be the architect of the whole war in Iraq, going before the United Nations and saying, hey, they have anthrax and everything else. This guy is going through Reagan's speeches and taking out his alien references. Well, Reagan got loose in Maryland, and it's on the record. As soon as we get Gorby to switch over to Bush, Bush is completely shutting down any reference to aliens, nothing, and all the rest of it. Because, as we know, he also denied President Carter that information when he was asked for it. And what did Carter do? Well, Bush was CIA director, but Carter fired him. This is the battle that's at the heart of what we're seeing inside the U.S. government. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Oh, nothing.
Okay.
I was laughing at you.
All right. Quotes here. I want to get us wrapped around the state within a state that's operating here and has so much of a role in 2024. And I have a lot more to get to here, but I'm going to roll through it as we do your questions. So let me read the quote and then we'll go to questions and I'll try to weave in the rest. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
All right. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is USA versus the Deep State Election X 2024 UFOs and the continuity of government. Before we go any further, I'm going to remind you here to go, especially if you're new, to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter. This is what keeps us in touch through the incredible, terrible censorship that we're witnessing on a regular basis. And, they're doing more and more of this, and I expect them to reach a point where they're just shutting down any vestiges of truth. But the newsletter helps us get around all that. It's a direct pipeline, and that's the best way to keep in touch with us. And it takes literally 1 minute to sign up, and we'll have you on there to let you know about the upcoming shows, the great guests that we have coming up from our fantastic guest roster, Gigi Young, Dr. Joseph Farrell, you name it. I mean, just incredible guests that we have on the show. And John Warner, of course, we're going to have him back soon, but he's been really putting a lot of incredible things on the record as well. And we just had a really interesting one with Walter Bosley last month on NIMSA, which I think comes into play here whenever we get around the UFO file, and especially Trump, because famously Trump is listed in that very, very early Sonora Aero Club with those very strange things that say Trump 45, Trump train. And it's this visioning out of something. The only problem is it's from 100 years ago. So how did they know? Over 100 years ago. So these are the questions, and this is where things get a little hairy. Before we go any further, though, I wanted to point this out because there's a lot of playing around on behalf of the deep state with, the conspiracy field. And it was very funny because I mentioned this to Olivia earlier that there's a, Vivek, I'm trying to think of his last name. Ramaswamy, that's it. And, he was on a Tucker Carlson interview and he starts talking about things and he goes out of his way and he's like, we need the truth about 9/11 and all the rest of it. And I was thinking, boy, boy, have things turned. People who are on the political side realize the desire for truth on behalf of people and will at times even exploit it. But nonetheless, there it is in the center of our speech now. We have the JFK assassination, the UFO file, 9/11. These things are rising on some level to the surface. And the danger is them getting co-opted for marketing purposes or for intelligence purposes as these groups compile their plan to consolidate power and roll out some of that advanced technology that they've been hiding for 80 years under the guise of national security. So here's one of their inside jokes, in my opinion. NASA and DARPA select Lockheed Martin to develop Draco nuclear
What?
propulsion demo. That's the one. And it's, it's a very popular sort of meme and theme in the alternative world about the Draco reptilians and all the rest.
So what does this thing do?
It's a nuclear propulsion demo in space. Hey,
Wow.
good old Draco reptilians.
They're rubbing our faces in it.
I think so. As I think Musk is as well with his blazing X.
I have a question about
Yes.
that. So, Boba the Con said, so I have to ask, one, DJ, curious to know what you think of the burning X Elon Musk posted today. And two, is this a message or is this a weird coincidence with all the fires going on? It disturbs me. It's creepy. I would also like to say your X that you put on your thumbnails for the X series is a burning X.
It's flaming. Yeah. There's an esoteric meaning behind the flaming X. And part of this goes to St. Andrew's cross and the vision of St. Andrew as he, insisted on being crucified, not on a cross, but on an X. And that when he was crucified, there was this incredible fire display. And it wasn't that they set it on fire. It was lighting up with some kind of apotheum. Now, what's interesting is Musk, along with all his controversial statements, tweeted out today. And this guy wants to, this is the guy who wants to put implants in your brain and control you. I mean, this is not innocuous. X as humanity's collective consciousness. Now, on any level, that's absurd if you were talking about it as a company. But bringing the technology together and incorporating it so that you become part of the machine, that's what that messaging is all about. Now, we've done a lot on the esoteric side of the X. And what you need to understand about it is as a symbol, it has a representation that goes back through the mystery schools for thousands of years. And in this context, in this period, it represents not just that esoteric knowledge, but it also represents the secret technology. It's the whole thrust of the kind of X footprint that we've followed in this program. But for him to say X is humanity's collective consciousness, can they get any more obvious about where they're going with this and also how they're bringing this forward? Now, I have pointed out before that they were signaling to each other, and I was doing this 2017, 2018, showing how they were competing with each other for who was going to represent the X thing. So you had Bezos, and he was always having the X around Blue Origin and standing in front of it and all the rest of it. And all of these different technology companies were utilizing that. But that program for the X piece goes all the way back to Nazi Germany, Walter Dornberger. He's, of course, the one who developed the X-15. And, it was actually Philip Corso, Colonel Corso, who went on the record and said, we developed the X-15 specifically to chase UFOs. That's what it was for. And that's what it was used for. So, that X technology, there's a tremendous crisscross, but here's the way that we lay it out on this program. The UFO file is how it's referred to in the deep intelligence circles. That's how you talk about it. You don't talk about different files. It's the UFO file. It's the collection of all of it. So the UFO file, that's the actual collection of all the UFO material. Inside the UFO file is the X technology. The X technology relates to technology from Tesla, John Keeley. It's anyone who's touched and crisscrossed in that field. That's all X technology. And the thing that I've put across on this show, and there's a lot of different reasons for it, but the technology aspect and the reason that the UFO file is so hidden has to do with the effect that they deal with, that we don't know the level of mastery that they have for this. But basically, the apotheum effect exists inside the X technology. When the UFO encounters happen, they express the same type of reality distortion field physics. Time changes, plants don't grow, people, entire towns are shorted out. All sorts of things happen that, defy reality. And the things I like to famously put online is whenever you go into the good UFO stories about abductions, they're always getting abducted through things. They get abducted through walls. In the Betty and Barney Hill story, they're floated into a craft. It's not like, hey, we're going to walk you along and walk up these steps. No, you're floating. And so it's all kinds of things that defy what we would understand as normal physical laws. So that's the whole apophthegm aspect. This is the nature of that technology and the secrecy around it. And I think it goes far beyond saying, well, if we reveal that there's somebody else with us here, or if there's an off-world civilization, that'll be too much for society to handle. I don't think that would require this level of secrecy. This level of secrecy, as physicist Robert Sarbarker said, was above the atomic bomb. And that was in 1950. And later he reiterated it in the 80s. So that secrecy is because of this effect. And that's the thing. I remember one time when Dr. Farrell was talking about torsion physics, and he referred to the idea of torsion physics, saying, get that stuff right, it makes the atomic bomb look like a firecracker. That's the level that we're talking about here. It's so far beyond the things that we understand, from the incredible scientific discoveries that we've made on the record, So with the Oppenheimer movie and all these things coming up, the reconsideration and looking back at almost 80 years of this atomic age, it's very strange, the whole rediscovery of it and how it went in this particular direction, and how uranium was used earlier for other reasons. So there's a big lost chapter of advanced technology development. We go into kind of a dark age on the public level, but I don't think we go into a dark age in those groups. I think that they maintain access to this information. So when we get into the period that we're in, we have to attribute something, more than just what the national security state would do with any ordinary secret. What they're doing with the UFO file is beyond that. And it's been getting deep into our geopolitical situation for at least 8 decades. Think about that as we move into this next section. Okay.
Can I throw something at you?
Yes, please.
Frank Salter says Dark Knight Rising X comes at the same time Space Force introduces their new Reaper emblem.
Exactly. I put that Reaper emblem on the thumbnail, and this is the 75th intelligence unit in the United States government.
We have 75.
And it's attached to Space Force. This is the Space Force intelligence unit. Remember, it took a long time after Trump left introducing this. And it's interesting because Space Force is honeycombed with Trump people. And so they've taken a long time throwing this guy out, throwing that guy out. And there's been a large and strange thing that we haven't seen before, which is open animosity in space agencies going on. And it's all happened this summer for the first time, I believe. And it started with our favorite general, Van Herk, who is the continuity of government leader, Northcom general, and the combatant commander of the United States. And he's also the head of NORAD. Those are 3 positions that are all one. Now, what's interesting about this is that he's being replaced by General Gilat. And that situation apparently annoyed him tremendously. And Van Herk has a very interesting history. As I've pointed out before, he was part of the 509th Bomber Squadron group, which is the same group that discovered the Roswell wreckage in the first place. Of course, he came much later, but there's a strange thing there. Just like with General Chance, who's leading Space Force, he also was at Malmstrom for a decade. So there's a lot of UFO crisscrosses here. The guy who's coming in, the new general, he is going to be, he's already been approved, but he's going to be instituted at the end of August. Literally, I think within about 10 days, we get a new COG commander. This is always a big deal. But as a result of that, we had Van Herk yelling publicly, saying that Space Command is deceptive. We are the ones who are in charge of ICBMs. And so this is very unusual language. And for anyone from NORAD to say Space Command is deceptive shows that there's something that has not been going on there before. I believe that Van Herk thinks he's the one to bring in the continuity of government when they decide to do the UFO threat. That's why they did the whole Canadian fiasco and shooting down UFOs and the Chinese balloon stuff and all this stuff and shooting down a UFO over Alaska. So Van Herk is very interesting in that sense. This guy who's coming in comes from MacDill. And if you go into the history of MacDill, it's almost like the whole place is just a swarm of UFO sightings down there in Florida. So incredible UFO signature around these COG commanders. I wanted to read something about continuity of government from Professor Scott so we get on the same page with it. And then we're going to go to your questions.
Okay, sounds good.
That's all there is to it. I thought this would crack everybody up, though. This is Washington Post. This is a real headline. The U.S. economy is great. Stop worrying about it. Hey, I'll tell you what, that replaces your brain. Don't analyze anything. Just, don't worry, be happy. Remember
Go back
that?
to sleep.
That's what passes for journalism. It's quite interesting. There was another great quote here. I thought this is too good to ignore. This is now University of Texas at Austin. Okay. And their new initiative for their journalism class. You ready? Leave neutrality behind. All right. So this is an article by Turley, the legal expert I mentioned. Quote, and he says, we have discussed the rise of advocacy journalism, where objectivity and neutrality are discarded in favor of social justice. Despite public trust and profits crashing in the media, faculty members are plowing ahead with a new model of journalism to the peril of their profession. The latest such example is found in the Solidarity Journalism Initiative at the University of Texas of all places.
Crazy.
In Austin. According to its website, the new initiative is being financed by tech companies and George Soros's Open Society foundations to help journalists, journalism educators, and journalism students to improve coverage of marginalized communities. Quote, the College Fix reports that the program was brought over from Santa Clara University after UT, University of Texas, hired Professor Anita Varma. The school is pushing students to use their lived expertise and to leave neutrality behind. That's right. No critical thinking, no balance, no checks and balances, just whatever Soros says, and whatever woke thing they're pushing. And instead of neutrality, they are pushing, quote, solidarity as a commitment to social justice that translates into action. Just solidarity. Hey, well, the Nazis had solidarity. Think about it. So, that's the nature, I think, of the shape that we're in broadcast-wise. They haven't taken the lesson that, from all the lies that they've spread. The media has for years, but they're at such a low point. And the real downslide started with the Trump campaign 2015 into 2016. They started to just openly be against him and just be like, we have to say anything, And when he won and they lost, in essence, they spent the whole 4 years just going after him. And that's where we got all that stuff, related to Putin and Russiagate. So that the big problem was, as I mentioned, and this is what's not mentioned or understood, they did not want Trump and Putin sitting down without a State Department or CIA intelligence person there, because they're afraid of that exchange, the same exchange that took place with Kennedy and Khrushchev, the same exchange that took place with Reagan and Gorbachev. The intelligence communities and what Gorbachev called that thing and then said the Pentagon, but the, the deep state, basically. When I go to negotiate with Reagan, what do? They start, putting in nuclear subs, close to Soviet ships and things. I mean, they want an incident. So this is the nature of that machine, and that machine is out of control in Ukraine. We'll do a separate special on Ukraine, but I do want to mention that that situation now on record has claimed 500,000 lives, 350,000 of which are Ukrainians. And they've tried to dice up the numbers there and be like, well, it's pretty level on both sides. No, look at the real numbers. On the record, you have 350,000 Ukrainians dead. For what? Really, for what? Because of this whole battle about NATO moving east toward Russia and the crazy neocons who brought us the Ukraine war and the Iraq war, and this endless war machine, and got us into dismantling Libya and making it a failed state, and Arab Spring and all this nonsense. That same group, headed up by these neocons, the Central Intelligence Agency, that whole piece is now in there, and they are demanding billions of dollars. This is worse than Vietnam. And, next, they're bringing us to the point of this nuclear interaction with Russia. For some reason, they want to bring it to this brink. And so, either they've lost their minds or there's something else in the mix to come here. But in any case, you think about it. I mean, how often do you have wars where 500,000 people are killed in a year? This is, what Professor Scott calls a World War I type savagery. And, no end in sight, no peace process. And they actually blow off the peace process. Anthony Blinken has to be one of the worst secretaries of state in history, not even proposing peace. And there's no intervention. It's just, give Lockheed Martin and all the defense contractors the money, and this thing keeps going on. Now, we know that there's a gigantic slush fund situation going on in Ukraine, so they have no motivation. It's only in exposing it through correct, information and journalistic channels that you're going to get anywhere. Well, unfortunately, that's not the nature of the situation. Okay. This quote from Professor Scott might give us some idea of what this other piece of the puzzle is operating there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is USA versus the Deep State, Election X 2024. We're going to have Olivia and your questions in about 2 minutes here, but I'm going to read this. It's from a fantastic, wonderful book Professor Scott put out just a couple of years ago called Dallas 63, the First Deep State Revolt Against the White House. And they finally made a print edition of it. It was electronic for a while, and we're lucky enough that the professor was able to do this. So here's what he has to say. Since writing these chapters, I've come more and more to analyze recent American history in the light of what I call structural deep events. Events like the JFK assassination, the Watergate break-in, Iran-Contra, or 9/11, which repeatedly involve law-breaking or violence, are mysterious to begin with and are embedded in ongoing covert processes. They have political consequences that enlarge covert government and are subsequently covered up by the systematic falsifications in the mainstream media and internal government records. Boy, does that sound familiar. The more I study these deep events, the more I see suggestive similarities between them, increasing the possibility that they are not unrelated external intrusions on American history, but parts of an endemic process, sharing to some degree or other elements from a common source. For example, one factor linking Dallas, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and 9/11 has been the involvement in all four deep events of personnel involved in America's highest level emergency planning, known since the 1950s as continuity of government, COG, or more colloquially inside the Pentagon as the Doomsday Project. A few of these actors may have been located at the top as overseers of the secret COG system. Others including some I shall discuss in this chapter, were located further down in its secret communications network. I see this planning group as one among many in what I have chosen to call the American deep state, along with agencies like the CIA, NSA, and private groups like Booz Allen Hamilton, to which more than half of the U.S. intelligence budget is outsourced. Think about that. Booz Allen Hamilton is, in effect, the CIA from that point of view, but without all the restrictions. And finally, the powerful banks and corporations whose views are well represented in the CIA and NSA. But if only one group among many, those in the COG planning group are also special because of their control and access of a communications channel not under government control that can reach deeply into the U.S. social structure, manipulate it, permanently affect it. COG planning was originally authorized by Truman and Eisenhower as planning for a response to a crippling atomic attack that had decapitated government. In consequence, its planning group contemplated extreme measures, including what Miami Herald reporter Alfonso Chardy in 1987 called suspension of the Constitution. That's a glimpse, an outline of this group operating with no oversight, who is in fact responsible for the United States government in the case of an emergency, like a UFO threat, for example. Especially the person at the top of that structure is the COG combatant commander. That's the Northcom commander, triple position with NORAD and COG. So, and remember, we didn't even have Northcom until 9/11. So these changes are new in the American story, and it's bringing us to this brink where the idea of us living under emergency powers is now very viable, especially after the dry run of COVID and all the rest of it. If we don't get to the source of these things for the 2024 election, remove the Biden regime, and put someone in there who understands constitutional government, like RFK Jr. or Trump, Trump for all his faults, certainly understands constitutional government and is not someone who was very favorable to the intelligence agencies. As a matter of fact, there's a hostility going on there between Trump and the intelligence agencies from day one. And as a matter of fact, it happened even before he was inaugurated. They try to prevent that. So, the deep state hunt that's on for Trump goes directly, and I mean directly, into how life is going to be lived in America by the citizens. So regardless if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green Party, it doesn't matter. If they can do it to one president and then use him as the kind of template for what they're doing to us, well, they had this recent thing, as I mentioned, and I actually have the story about Attorney General Barr, who we know was really, I mean, Barr is a very dirty player, but he was Bush's lawyer when Bush was the CIA director. That's how far back he goes. And of course, we know his dad was the one who got Jeffrey Epstein going in the university process, giving him phony credentials and all the rest. So it's an incredible thing there. It's very ironic for him to die, Epstein, that is, under Barr's overseership. So we have a very interesting situation there, which is unresolved. But Barr starts musing about this case and talking very out loud and giggling to himself and saying, when they ask him, are you giving Jack Smith information? He's like, I'm not allowed to talk about it. So they may have planted Barr in there directly for this actual moment. But one of the things that he starts talking about is how Trump could be under house arrest in prison. Like this would be more palatable. And then MSNBC has these weird shows where they're drooling over each other and they go, I wonder if Melania would come for conjugal visits. So the level of the psychosis that passes for news reporting is remarkable. And it seems to only get worse. Like they haven't learned anything. There's been no reform since the incredible overreach of all the things that they've been doing. But we have to watch the situation with the Trump indictments, because what they represent is the indictment of our vote. And we have to remember that, because what they're doing is they're taking an individual who right now is leading in all the polls, would be president if the election were held today, has been president, was removed as president under a very, very, circus style banana republic election. So, it puts us in a situation where your vote doesn't count. And now they're trying to criminalize the idea by using Trump as the example. Say, well, he questioned the election. Anyone who questions an election based on this precedent, we can put in jail. That's the nature of the problem. They can't stand populism because, in fact, they're very unpopular. And this is where we're going with this. Justin Trudeau, 28% in the Canadian polls. Stepford Biden, 36% as president, even with all the media on his side. Think about it. They don't have the majorities to control. What do they have? Emergency powers. Macron in France, he executes emergency powers to raise the retirement age. Justin Trudeau, the truckers go after him. Bam. I'm pressing the emergency button. The tanks roll. Lock up all their money electronically. So the digital money is not safe. And Stepford Biden, well, there's a number of things, but they say what they're playing around with is the idea of a climate emergency. That's where you're seeing this going. So the emergency powers thing is something that, there's not a whole lot of time left for people to adopt to understanding that the goal of these things is emergency powers. So, and I think one of the things that we've been really, I've pointed out strongly on this show is the emergency powers piece related to the UFO file is the penny that needs to drop. This is the thing that needs to open up in terms of understanding around what's happening in America, because they have a fantastic opportunity by promoting the false CIA UFO threat operation to promote the COG takeover, basically. And people have talked about other options, cyber attacks, climate emergency, nuclear, all the rest of it. But the thing that they've been developing for 80 years is the UFO takeover threat. That is the piece. And they have now a UFO defense office. Can you believe it? And it's amazing because you have, the Bobos of previous times, like Tom DeLonge, going out on Twitter and saying, boy, that CIA is so great. I admire them. Sure, they had to make some tough decisions keeping this from the public, but wow, they're giving us the truth now, And, that's supposed to be the face of that UFO disclosure movement. Think about that, literally. And then the Patriot Act, architect sitting there propping up his puppet Grush. And I made note of Grush during the congressional hearings, what I called the Grush head snap, because he kept snapping his head back to hear the instructions from his handler, Charles McCullough, who is the chief legal spook. I mean, look it up. That's just in his bio. It's him saying it, not me. So, we need to get on board with this and the nature of it. In the 2024 election and that campaign, bringing forward this piece, Bobby's finally taking off the gloves on Biden. This is the good development. And on the Trump side, he continues to kind of be in the center of that spotlight. As they try to take him down more and more. Now they're talking about a fifth indictment, as I mentioned, in Arizona. So they will not stop. And so the only thing that can stop them is a very aware public and, this type of reporting. But if we don't understand what they're after him for, then it's a great deficit in our understanding. I can tell you, based on the research that I have, it's not just for his positions or for populism. The populism, for sure, has a lot to do with it. But in my opinion, it is the system and the risks to that secret system of a Trump presidency or an RFK Jr. presidency. Forget it. That's the nature of the threat and the problem that they're under. And their response, put every card on the table. Go after this guy, bring him down no matter what. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm turning it over to you and your questions.
A little bit of a bad moment. Just give
That's
me
okay.
1 second.
You're fine.
Okay, so let me start here.
Yeah.
Don Neway says, Nancy Pelosi delighted at how exquisite and beautiful the indictments are against Trump and, quote, much better than anything she could have come up with. And Ira says, what's the deal with Trump's Secret Service while he goes inside? Is he in any real danger?
Well, I do. I think it's a danger. And also this Georgia thing, they're like, hey, we're gonna lay on the cuffs and like fingerprint them and mugshot them and all this stuff, which they avoided doing in the Bragg case. They're trying to come up with a racial element to these cases. And I say that because I've noticed how they operated in the last year of Trump's presidency with BLM, giving them tremendous money and effort, and everyone had to live through all that nonsense of the things that they were doing. And then the leaders got all exposed as buying houses, in the most white neighborhoods in Los Angeles and living it up, and not sharing any of that. Had these people making like $200 million. So that was a sick time and a sick movement, but they love to create these divisions. So now they're doing it with two black DAs, and they're like, hey, the black DA against Trump. But then the next thing that they do is they say, oh, those DAs are getting threats. So it looks, unconsciously and psychologically, people are supposed to process it as Trump is threatening the black community.
Well, and Trump supporters are. I mean, what they're really
Yes.
they are baiting Trump supporters. They want to
Exactly.
make MAGA look like a bunch of racist hicks
Right.
with guns.
Yeah.
They want a gun grab. We know this.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask this question. Dean Tant says they want the Constitution suspended so badly they're getting closer. And SM says they need to break the Constitution, US dollar, and the bonds before the CBDC can be implemented. They need a reason to default, so they are provoking the populace to have a reason. They are provoking the populace.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. This is all laid out and systematic. It can fail. This is the nature of the thing. The overreach can fail, and it's ugly. The whole thing is ugly. Remember, the intelligence services, when you dig into the mentality, it's so ugly, it would be hard for an average person to comprehend. And the things that they've tried to do and in utilizing the media. It's such a shameful chapter that I don't think there is another chapter like it in American history, because even with McCarthyism and things of that nature, it did not reach the level that it's reaching, where they're trying to reach out and silence an individual citizen. They would go after groups, they would target writers and things like that. But what they're trying to do is silence any political speech. And so it is a perilous election that we're coming to. One of the things I'd like to point out is that this year is so crucial because 2024 is the election year, and that's where so many things are going to go down. But this is the setup year that we've been having this whole period of time, and there's still substantial time, about 4 months left in this year. Everything that happens in 2024 is going to be based on the effects of this year. And what you've seen happen this year, RFK Jr. joined the presidential run. Trump is under all these indictments, but he's winning. And, all the things that they did with the UFO shoot down and the COG test drive, all the things they're doing with the environmental destruction and the attempts to freeze political speech, how that situation plays out and how the public response is going to be very, very crucial. So this is the nature of the thing that we're looking for here. And what I would say is this has to be a little different than like the COVID lockdown, for example. I think that people should be much more vocal, shove back a lot harder, legally, nonviolently, and collectively, very strongly as a group. And I think, I always break it down into categories, but for example, I'll use the UFO file as an example. When you have a movement and money run by intelligence people that rolls into a field like the UFO file, boot it out. So don't accept it. When you have researchers who go along with it, question them, ask them, why are you working with CIA people when CIA people are trying to bring in a threat? Make them answer. Make them take a side, because it's important. And my feeling directly out of the UFO research piece is no CIA people should be allowed in it at all, ever. Because CIA and counterintelligence people have spread lies and have used that field for 80 years. It has nothing to do with real research. So it's very important as that becomes, like News Nation latching onto that, and New York Times and all this stuff rolling through the traditional media, building the threat. The job of the alternative side of the media, the independent media, is to reject it, not to try to embrace it to get on Ancient Aliens, or something like that. And there's so much, you know, trite stuff which is so spent, that's all old hat. Contact in the Desert, Ancient Aliens, even the people showing up there, you know, they're far past their prime in doing this kind of work. They're just hanging in there because it's some producer's idea. It's nothing to do with reality. This is a very vital subject matter, and it needs to break out of all that trappings and get back to uh, the nature of what it is, which is personal experience with the mysterious, using the best researchers, relating it directly to the geopolitical scientific situation. That's totally different from this, kind of militaristic approach and shooting down those aliens that are shooting around. Oh, they're in our skies, Senator Gillibrand and her phony speeches and stuff. So, and Rubio, the neocon being in charge of the UFO defense office. I mean, come on, this is insane. So, all that stuff needs to be loudly and roundly, uh, really called out. It can't be um, allowed to roll in without being exposed. So I apply that now. I'm talking about the UFO file. It is a big subject there, but I'm applying it now in all types of different areas. So in the media side, there was this big report, and someone was mentioning it, and I had seen it earlier today about Alex Jones saying that they had got this report, and it was, they have a lot of very, very good sources over there, and they got a report that the Biden administration was going to try to, come back in with COVID restrictions in the fall. No, like you cannot allow the situation to go into that. And when it comes to the elections in 2024, again, you can't allow all the mail-in elections or like a COVID fraud type situation. So it's going to be just like, no, I'm not going to surrender my cash and get the CBDC. There has to be a big no in relation to dealing with this on the public side, and you have to start in any way that you can. It doesn't, a lot of people wonder about the impact of the decisions that they make. But for me, I've seen a very small statement make a very big impact at times. And I always say it's the intention and the echoes of the ripple of that intention that makes a huge difference in all of this. And so it's not, that all of it, not everything that can be done has been done in terms of trying to go through the traditional channels to turn around the situation. Exposing it really, really, at certain key moments, like the collapse of the Grush thing, is so crucial. I can't explain it to you timing wise. Everything is about timing. And that's if you've ever gone back, and I've read a lot of biographies, but I read biographies of boxers. I've read a number of them, musicians, boxers, performers. There's something about their backgrounds that intrigues me. But boxers, when they talk about their career, they're like, yeah, all the training and everything helped me, but it was the timing in the moment that did it. I had to take a chance to make a chance. And I feel like that's the type of advice that we need. So it is a political process. It's a consciousness process. It's a journalistic endeavor. And, all of those things, judicial process, they're all open to us. We have them right now. They're still available and they should be used. And, whenever anyone talks about like we're at war, it should be, it's going to be a shooting war and all that stuff. The way that I look at it is the traditional methods of resistance to the type of things that are happening have not been tried across the board in an organized fashion. And that's the real way towards true lasting change. And it's funny, they were talking about Trump being arrested and running for president. I was like, who's the last famous person who led social change that got arrested? I mean, there's so many, including Assange and everyone else. But really, Martin Luther King is a great example. Part of the trial, of his life was going to jail. And he would include it in his speeches. He's like, we'll get up, we'll protest together, we'll do this together, we'll march together, we'll go to jail together. And that was the nature of what he was talking about. And he got that from Gandhi, who they kept putting in prison. And like the more they put him in jail, the bigger and more powerful he became. Well, when they put a president in jail, like they're trying to do to Trump, they're just trying to lock us up. And so we can't allow it to happen. And the best way to show that is to be aware of it and to push back on it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is USA versus the Deep State Election X 2024 UFOs and COG. Boy, you never thought the UFO file would be so important, but it is, right? Yes.
Michael Snow, the big question. Did you catch AJ's release today along with Jack Posobiec? Lockdown, masks, PCR testing for TSA and Border Patrol by mid-September, and full population lockdowns coming by mid-October. Confirm?
Well, that's the thing I just mentioned. And it's only based on their reports that I've heard anything about it. But that's the thing that can't be allowed to happen. And I think that they would try it through the climate operations. If they're trying it through COVID, people really tapped out with the COVID op. And but I believe that the nature of the things that they're trying are, a kind of a consolidation and a data mining operation. They have a lot of data from COVID of the things that people would take, the things that they wouldn't, what led to uprisings and all the rest of it. Remember that one of the experiments with 2020 was lockdowns, keeping people indoors, which is something that has never been done under any circumstances. Even in World War II, wasn't done, and people weren't locked down. So this was the dream of the World Economic Forum, to enslave the world, the deep state. This is the deep state's ultimate dream, and they want to do it. Remember that dream is operational from space to control things on the ground with a massive space grid. So this is where the nature of what they're moving into. What I will say is this, which is a lot of the things that you got out of the lockdowns, so they added BLM, Antifa, and all that kind of stuff. They were able to amp it up, and they also took advantage, with J6 by having provocateurs and setting that whole thing up. But basically, if you see a lot of these kind of almost violent reactions to things, psychologically, really, a lot of it's based on the fact of closing people in. And they're easy to manipulate that way. So you could do all kinds of things with them. So when they rolled ops like BLM or J6 out, it was much easier for people to latch onto. And I'm convinced that those are the very same people who ran all the Q stuff too. And, they got into a situation where they were really, whoever pirated that stuff was really making the situation, getting us into that situation. And it's fascinating to look back at it, because one of the things that they were using was this Kennedy connection and the whole thing about JFK Jr. and all the rest of it. To me, that was the trademark of an intelligence operation, because their cheap obstacle in life, since that organization, their biggest challenge was John F. Kennedy. And so to call that whole thing up, to me, that was a great signal that this was intel that operated from an intel basis. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, could the WHO treaty override the Constitution? And Richard Warner said, it only works if the people go along with it.
No, it's true. And, the good thing is that we have representatives like RFK Jr. out there in this race, putting it out, and he's not holding anything back. Trump's disruption also is very positive in this sense. So there's a lot of disruptors out there for this. So the thing that needs to happen strongly is to consolidate behind the people who are bringing it forward, and bringing the heat. And what's interesting is, I hear this a lot in alternative media. I don't know. I couldn't disagree with anything more. It is that the presidential election doesn't matter, and I point this out over and over again. The body politic is how it works, and the head is the president. So you have to have a good head in order to operate the body politic. And for me, that's having a new president. You can't have them roll in Stepford Biden again because he's controlled by committee. God knows what would happen to America if that committee got in charge again. No, I think that they know that either way, that administration's on its way out. That's why I think they would resort to things like the continuity of government program. So I think that's the situation that we're in. Yes.
Russell Gill, why is the deep state hell bent on absolutely no peace between the United States and Russia?
Well, they have been since World War II. That's been their MO. So the competitor level with Russia is one thing. There's an esoteric piece here also. Remember Casey's very interesting prediction about Russia, that someday Russia would be the hope of the world. Well, they don't want hope in this world. So they're probably aware of whatever that is as well. So we need to keep that in mind, and that them making the Russians our enemy is, it's just like when we went against Hitler and they made the Russians our friend, and they were like, hey, Uncle Joe, Stalin is there for us. Let's not forget that, and that goes back to the Orwell thing again. No, we're no longer at war. We're at peace. We were never at war with Oceania. It is a constant moving of the equation, and the nature of that is a kind of deep control. Something very special about Russia in relation to the UFO file piece that I've been mentioning here, and that I think that is the piece that's been disrupted since Kennedy, Khrushchev met Reagan, Gorbachev, and again, it comes up in Trump and Putin. So this group, the Biden group that got in, they're just continuing on what Obama was already, going into this very aggressive position against Russia. They had decided, look, the way we consolidate the world with the UFO file, CBDC, and all the rest of it, one world government does not include those guys being independent. No way. And they deduced, although Russia has a tiny, and I mean a tiny amount of our military and a tiny amount of our economy, we're much bigger. But it's interesting because on the surface, they have more nuclear weapons, in fact, than we do. Their weapon systems are very well developed. But I think that it's their influence, and the fundamental influence, and the UFO file that makes them absolutely crucial for consolidation. Also, in areas like Syria, where we wanted to go in, and Obama was like, there's a red line that's been drawn. And then he couldn't get any support to go into Syria. And then afterwards, he was like, my biggest accomplishment was not sending troops into Syria, which he wanted to do. And he sent Kerry before the United Nations, good old rubber face Kerry. And it's interesting, too, because, these people and the things that they mean to accomplish go back. If you remember, there were a number of things that came out about the nations that they wanted to take over this is before we invaded Iraq. They had already laid out the plan, and a number of those nations included, they wanted Syria and Iran, and Syria was the stepping stone to Iran. When they were thwarted in Syria by Russian support, again, that meant they couldn't take over the Middle East. So you start to see part of the problems. But for me, if you go deep, it's the UFO file, and also the fact that anyone who understands the Russians and the UFO file knows that they're at the same level or greater in relation to the United States on the UFO file front and have a great mastery of space as well. So if the plan is consolidation and these guys aren't in, what do? You try to force them out. Yes.
Thomas Ball says, well, we have weapons to destroy the planet and we don't really know who's in charge. Great. Who's in charge, DJ?
Well, we see their footprints all the time. I want to share an amusing thing with you on this. Let's see if this is a roundabout way of answering that. So I was thinking about Roy Cohn and Roy Cohn's incredible crisscross with the deep state, the mafia aspects, and aerospace, and his kind of deep imprint in the Trump career and situation. So there's a lot of people out there, and there's a lot of unanswered questions. But think about this, and we've got, of course, Cohn, and his political protege was Trump. There's no question about it. He helped Trump rise, and he gave him all that inside influence about how to make yourself, the king of New York before you became president. But I was thinking about a Star Trek episode, and I printed out a couple of different clips from this, but the episode's called Piece of the Action. And what happens is one of these Federation starships leaves a piece of technology behind, and all of these mafia people start to develop the society, all these people on this planet, based on a book that's left behind about the Chicago mobs. But it's an interesting thing because when you get around Roy Cohn, there's a big crisscross there with this article, with this episode, because really, if you go back and look at this, you have these mafia kingpins running around using advanced communication, and, we have to kind of dress down to their level and to get our phasers back and all this stuff. And the group, that planet, they were so imitative that they were worried if they left any of the technology behind that these mafia people would, develop this whole civilization and then come after us in space. It's kind of funny because part of the deep state piece is this aerospace piece mixed with the mafia. So there's something really key about Roy Cohn and also Trump himself, who there's no question there's a lot of mafia behind Trump, but also Trump has the great aerospace connection. So this weird aerospace mafia crisscross. And we know, of course, there's a mafia intelligence crisscross. But now you start to see, how this whole thing could operate, that you're dealing, I remember this whole comparison about, the current era. And you have some people saying, well, it's kind of like if you gave a caveman a ray gun, Well, if you have this advanced technology that's developed in the UFO file and the X technology inside of that, and then you have all these groups vying for power, and somehow the mafia aspect runs across it through the likes of like a Roy Cohn character, it explains a lot of the tension with Trump, in my opinion, very, very well. Also, an interesting little side note, which is that Donald Trump was a very big Kennedy donor long before any of this stuff came up about Trump and Kennedy and all. If you go back in there, he has actually helped numerous. I think I've counted a half dozen Kennedys get into office with his contributions. So, there's a Trump Kennedy crisscross that goes back, and I think it's crucial to understand it. Another thing I wanted to mention is there are people who, like Cohn, who represent a larger picture. And, the book I go back to often, which circulated not as a book, but as a series of these little articles that would get out. And that's the Torbit document, was equivalent to WikiLeaks. It was like 1970. And there's all this information in there about Defense Industrial Security Command. That's not something that's on the books anywhere, but it gives you the whole breakdown of DISC. This is the group, and they control the UFO file, and von Braun is at the very top of it, and the agents inside that group are people like Guy Bannister and all the rest. And when you have people like Bannister, as I've mentioned, managing Oswald in New Orleans before the assassination and knowing Garrison and all that, then you're dealing directly with the UFO file. Whenever you get around the Kennedy assassination, you're smack into airspace in the UFO file. When Oswald goes to work in the Texas School Book Depository, remember, only 6 weeks before the president gets there, goes by that window, and nobody knows, supposedly, that he's going to be there. Oswald walks in, and he's walking into a building to work that is owned by someone who's investing heavily in experimental aerospace and who also happens to be the cousin of Admiral Byrd, D.H. Byrd, who also started the Civil Air Patrol. Now, if that isn't a crisscross of influences the minute you walk into the building, one of the famous things that Garrison was very confused by when he went to go find the people who had worked with Oswald at Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans is that they had all gone on to aerospace jobs, usually at NASA or Lockheed Martin. And he was like, that's weird. What happened to all those guys? They were just working here last summer. And so they were all gone. But then he found out from talking to people around that Riley Coffee Company that Oswald told them all when he left, I'm going to work for NASA. I found my pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Is that what he said?
Yeah.
Wow.
And they sent him to Dallas to be caught up in that whole op in the Texas School Book Depository. But look at that. Immediately, and then if you put him back at Atsugi in Japan, he's right near what? The top secret U-2. That's the program that he works on. So this is somebody who's involved in secret aerospace his whole life, basically. And this is, what he's surrounded by. So when you get into the Garrison investigation, you get very close to that aerospace intelligence state within a state thing. And if you can understand that piece, then, we start to understand the deep state by understanding the technology that they use. And when you bring in the mafia side, there's no question, Professor Scott, who coined the deep state, said that lowest level is organized crime. And then the levels above that use it, intelligence, the farmed out intelligence to Booz Allen Hamilton and others. Then beyond that, the oil companies, the extreme wealth companies, and then the management of those companies. But it's interesting because a lot of researchers try to put that mafia side up top, giving everybody orders, which I find interesting. Supposedly, they're the ones taking the orders. So if that is true, there could have been a group that was connected with the mafia who decided we don't want to take orders anymore. We're getting into this aerospace stuff. That might be the Roy Cohn, Trump crisscross. You could be looking at basically a kind of space mafia. I kid you not. And what is Trump responsible for? The Space Force. And the Kennedys are no stranger to mafia influence either. And they're closely connected with space activities. So it opens up a chapter there. And, I think that's to be continued, as it were. Yes.
Tim Houston says, Jim Keith, NASA, Nazis, and JFK. And Najat Madri said, but how much is the mafia truly supporting Trump at this point?
No, I don't mean that, there was all this casino money and Sheldon Adelson and all these people who were giving, casino money to Trump to keep his candidacy and presidency alive. And the mafia is involved on all sides. They put money down on all kinds of candidates. But the background with Trump, when you open casinos in Atlantic City and stuff, you can't do it without mob approval. And that type of thing in Trump Towers and stuff, that's Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, and the key thing, I still don't think that we quite get the picture with Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn is somebody who's involved in the deep state. What did Dr. Farrell bring forward? He brought forward that he's working with McCarthy in that early period. And McCarthy, of course, has Robert Kennedy on his staff. And they are getting into Blue Book and questioning and interrogating these generals about Blue Book. So that's already, he's already back then in 1952 at the crisscross of all this stuff. 30 years later, everything that he knows, and then in the 70s and 80s helping Trump the way that he did, Trump could never have gotten this far. But what did he learn from Cohn? He must have learned tremendous things from him. So you have Trump learning from Cohn, you have Trump learning from Nixon. Look, when I started this series, the X series, nobody knew anything about Trump and Nixon at all. And the research that I did on Trump and Nixon, I said, their relationship went on for decades. They were close, and actually that Nixon lived in Trump housing in New York. He got him office space so he could spend all this time with him. And the Nixon library, when they were, got information about Trump and Nixon, they said, no, there's no history like that. There's a letter that Nixon wrote. And Nixon wrote a letter in 1987, and it said, you're going to be president, basically. And that someone had predicted. Everyone thought it was Pat Nixon, but I think it was Gene Dixon. And what's interesting is in 2020, the Nixon library said, we have 300 letters. They had years of correspondence, and there it was. This is the interesting thing, which is we're ahead of the curve on these things because we're looking for the actual evidence of the crisscross of these people. One of the crisscrosses that I'm pointing out tonight has to do with Trump and Gorbachev and Trump and Putin. And then the Kennedy influence with Gorbachev. There's a network, there's a crisscross here, a kind of an X-share thing. And this is what we need to kind of step up to. Remember when we came out after the TTSA came out and said, well, this guy Elizondo never ran a program called ATIP, and presented a number of things about it. Everyone was like, you can't stand real disclosure and all the rest of it. And then all the Elizondo stories fell apart, including the fact that in writing, he had to admit to the Inspector General, the intelligence community, that, actually there was no ATIP. It was just an activity of mine. It wasn't a government funded program. So he was just able to use that because the media didn't question it. The CIA rifled him through. But he was a very unsteady character for this kind of work. And they wanted to graduate to something like what they did with Grush, Gary Nolan, and all this stuff. All CIA. It's all CIA. Nolan's worked for the CIA for over 10 years. That's in his bio. That's what he has to say about it. And he's a Stanford professor who's an immunologist and works on all these projects for the CIA. And who's his, big buddy? Dr. Fauci. Well, I think it's a fair chance to say, if you're saying on Twitter, hey, Dr. Fauci has done all these incredible things, thank you, and all the rest. That's the kind of UFO disclosure you're going to get, Fauci disclosure. So, there has to be some kind of reckoning in thought around these things. And I see it coming once in a while. I remember I did the UFO file assassins X Protect. It's a documentary from 2020. It has all the information about how Thane Eugene Caesar worked for Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. This is the crucial aspect. So that discovery and putting it in that documentary, a month ago, that got picked up. It's 3 years later. A month ago, that got picked up. And they were like, hey, Lockheed Martin, that's where they do UFOs. They didn't even mention Skunk Works. If you go deeper, Thane Eugene Caesar, who's the security guard who assassinated Kennedy, was working for Skunk Works. He's 26 years old. And he gets hired at the Ambassador Hotel 3 days before the Kennedy assassination. So, the assassination history is a dreadful history. But if you can get through it and get past what they laid out as the stories, then over and over again, you'll find the defining moments, just like Professor Scott found the defining moments in deep events were continuity of government people. He's absolutely right. But they, over and over again in the assassinations, they're related to airspace. And there's a reason for that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is USA versus the Deep State, Election X 2024, UFOs and COG. Of course, we're indebted on this program to people like Professor Peter Dale Scott, my conversations with the Canadian Defense Minister, Paul Hellyer, who told us everything about how Canada handled UFOs, and he was the defense minister. He ought to know. People like the late Jim Mars, the late Stanton Friedman. I mean, these were people that I spent hours and hours with, engaging with them. And the point is that they understood the subject and they wanted to take it on. They weren't looking for a CIA side job, and they didn't want to be in the, they weren't doing it just to be in somebody's documentary. They had a different ethic about the work that they were doing. And if you look at Mars, Mars went as far as anybody on the JFK assassination. He got into the UFO file. And then one of the last books he was working on was all about how he figured out at the finality of his life, and he told me about this. We had long conversations about it, that basically the corporations were trying to kill people. And he said it was all about depopulation. That's what they believed in, and that he figured it was an extension of the Nazi agenda. And that's where he came to. That was his Fourth Reich moment. And, that's pretty heavy, because a lot of the things he came out with in that book, which maybe was 2016, was even before COVID, before all these things. And we lost him, I think 2017. So, but if you think about that being the kind of end realization for him, we have to think about that really seriously. And I think a lot of people may want to go back to that book and his study on the corporations. Yes, Miss Olivia, we're going to take 2 more questions and then we're going out. We'll be out.
Okay, so Mirror 13 says, does DJ think Nixon's X letter is still at the White House?
Well, there's 2 different things there. So the Nixon letter that Robert Merritt carried a copy of, and that was kept in the White House as a time capsule, was for when UFO disclosure came about. There were instructions for finding it, and somehow it was going to be uncovered. Somebody knew where it was. But Merritt's story, and Merritt had a very detailed history. I checked him out top to bottom for his intel background, the Watergate story, and all the rest of it. And before Merritt passed away, he put a number of things on the record with me. One of the things he put on the record was that he was a courier. He didn't really present his position as anything higher than that. And he was a courier, and that Nixon said, basically, you have to take this and give it to Henry Kissinger. And it was a copy of this time capsule letter with UFO disclosure in it, talking all about the advanced technology they had got from UFOs and all the rest of it. So that letter, I think, when Trump was in the White House, I think there was a search and a competition between the intelligence agencies and Trump related to that, to see if it was still there, to see if it was possible. But certainly Kissinger had a copy of it, and supposedly someone else did. So, yeah, I think that will come out at some point. Absolutely. Now, there's another X letter related to Nixon. These are the stealth archives. They're things just like the JFK records. We know they're out there, but they become a centerpiece of the X series because there's something that I found over and over again. And there's Rockefeller research on the UFO file that we can't get our hands on, because those are the volumes of their study for America that you can't access. But they let all their other stuff out. They were like, study of racial equality in the United States in 1960, like all these different studies that they did, and they got the best people. But when the UFO file one, they would never let out. That's a very interesting point. But the person who headed it up was Henry Kissinger, and that came out through a scientist that was familiar with Robert Sarbarker. And so that's a whole different story. But there's no question that Kissinger is very high up in that whole piece. But the letter that is on that LBJ left, it was an X letter, and it was to be opened in June of this year. And so there's a whole thing about it. Oh, in 1994, it was partially opened and the CIA resealed it because it was classified. But don't worry, it just related to like Nixon in Vietnam. No. uh, at the LBJ library, they're under instructions from LBJ as his dying wish to open this 50 years later. It's the X envelope. It's at their library. And so, there's this whole song and dance about the partial opening. So it's something like 40 pages inside of this, and they're penned by LBJ himself. I'm sure it's relating to the very same X technology. And again, these people put things together so that when this comes out, they knew that at some point there'd be some kind of rollout of, maybe they thought even in a more earnest way it would come out. Will it be disclosure because they couldn't hide it anymore? I don't know if they knew it would come out, as this kind of false Central Intelligence Agency version. But in any case, they wanted their role in history understood in relation to it. So LBJ, Nixon, Reagan, these are people who left defined records. And what's interesting is there's a time capsule that Eisenhower left. And you know when that's supposed to be opened? 2050.
Oh.
Deal with that. It's weird. The last thing I'll mention about time capsules is that the Georgia Guidestones, before they were blown up, they give coordinates to a time capsule that's supposed to be there as well. So I always thought that was weird when the Guidestones got blown up, but I don't have any information on the fact that somebody got their hands on that. But there's a time capsule association there as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is USA versus the Deep State, Election X 2024, UFOs and COG. If you haven't already and you're new here, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our free newsletter. It keeps us in touch, and you're going to find through the censorship that we're seeing move forward, there's going to be a lot of reasons for that. I was talking about a person as an imprint of something. Do you ever notice once in a while Liz Cheney comes up and she headed up the J6 committee and it was all this, and that's the stuff that's supposedly fueling the Jack Smith J6 nonsense? Well, she's the representative in our political process of continuity of government, just as General Van Herk is, because her dad, Dick, he's the one who set up continuity of government. He was a crucial factor with Rumsfeld and Oliver North and others. They did it in the 80s and 90s, but they'd been in government since the 60s. And, they used continuity of government during the 9/11 attacks. That's something that Professor Scott put on the record. Liz Cheney's presence, look, she was booted out as a congresswoman. She couldn't get 30% of the vote. There's no reason for them to tout her as a presidential candidate the way MSNBC does. They want this weird Republican in. It's because she represents that other system. And that other system doesn't want anything to do with a Trump or RFK Jr. presidency. That much is for sure. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I have two last questions. I don't want to give up on either one of them. Okay. So I'm going to start with this one. Planet Nine says, have these people uncovered immortality and therefore don't want a large population?
Yeah, not immortality. No, I
Close
don't.
to it.
I mean, I think that there's a striving for that. Remember, this whole thing, if you go deep into it, the transhumanist aspect, the top of that chain is the androgyne, right? It's a totally androgynous figure. And one of the things in the tree of life that they get to is they go from animal to mineral in the kind of hermetic version of the tree of life. What they're trying to do is, without rising through the levels of spiritual advancement, become, gods themselves by going around the process. And they're moving up through the technology. They want to project their consciousness into the technology. That goes to the Ahriman piece. That goes to Steiner's version of the eighth sphere, this kind of virtual reality trap for souls. And the Ahrimanic piece that he predicts back there in 1920, coming into the 21st century, is remarkable in a sense, because nobody really had access to this type of vision of a technological future. And it would start to seep into consciousness more and more. But interestingly enough, Steiner's version of Ahriman as this dark astral force coming in and sort of incarnating and, basically becoming a kind of technological devil. um, this is something that is remarkable, and it shows the incredible psychic clairvoyant faculties. I mean, Steiner was a genius. And of course, I'm talking about Rudolf Steiner, the head of anthroposophy. He's the Austrian mystic we've done many shows on, and it's deep, deep in the X series, and who Gigi Young's done so many great shows on now. But there's something about Steiner, which is a message. It's that message in the bottle thing. We're going to come back to the theme we started with, which is that he brought this forward and he was projecting out and he was saying, this thing, humanity shouldn't run from it. They should come right face to face with the technology. And, but it can't, if it falls upon humanity unawares, then it could interrupt the entire spiritual evolutionary track of humanity. And I think that, what I say about Steiner's work is he spent 4 decades basically trying to outline the reality of this Ahrimanic piece to us. And that really, if you thread through all of his work, he's talking about Ahriman. And sometimes blatantly, he has all kinds of things about Ahriman coming into the 21st century. But other times when you read it, you're like, oh, this is what is Ahrimanic. This is the nature of what it is. And it's a kind of cleverness, and it's a kind of sophistication. It's a mathematical, everything can be weighed and measured type of scientific materialism. This is the foothold that Ahriman got in the 19th century. And it happened apparently between 1840 and 1845 in Steiner's work. And that the mystery schools got together and said, I know we're good at keeping secrets, but look at this, the scientific materialism will sever any knowledge of the spiritual from humanity. If we don't do something, humanity, you won't even recognize it in 100 years. And a lot of the people in the mystery schools, even the advanced people, were like, we can't let this out. Humanity, won't know how to handle it. And they've been used to being behind the scenes, moving the culture along. But enough of that group said, no, we have to put it out. And that's why you get this incredible spiritualistic, the seance craze and the spiritualism of the 1850s and 60s, the early attempts, the Poughkeepsie Seer and a number of different things bringing this forward, that the compromise in all of it is Helena Blavatsky and Theosophy. That comes out, and it is an earthquake. And we're still living in the ripples of that earthquake today. There's no question about it. The Fox sisters and all the things that happen with them, also very important in all this. And of course, it's Steiner's work that comes out of Theosophy ultimately, but it goes to the Western initiatory tradition, Rosicrucian side, instead of trying to harken back to another age of Eastern wisdom. Steiner had figured out, the Eastern wisdom set the stage for the Western initiatory process to happen. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And that's that's where we're at. Yes, Miss Olivia, last question.
Okay. This is a great last question.
I believe it.
Michael Snow. Awesome show as always. Are we facing the Belial group now? Is the Amelius group the way to the light and immortality? Belial group missed out and believes they can achieve it now?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, this is the Belial piece that comes from the Casey work was very active. So the scientists of Belial in the Casey work created a gigantic 2i stone power network, and they took its spiritual function that the Amelius group had developed, and they changed it so that they made it physically dominant. So they could use, for example, something that the Amelius group had attuned to the outer spheres with, what Casey calls the saintly realm. They used that same technology to build lasers. And so the 2i stone was a faceted crystal, and it ran Atlantis. And the part of Atlantis that was called Poseidia, the Milas group ran. And that piece is the Bimini Poseidian temple, that whole area there in the hot zone. That area still has the repercussions of this two-eye stone. And you still read all kinds of strange magnetic anomalies in relation to this, and the strange echoes and the strange stories down there. And by the way, UFOs are so common in Bimini, they call them fireflies. They just see them all over the place. That's also related. So in terms of the Belial group, that whole energy, it's the same thing as the Ahriman group. It's literally Casey using the name that was given to it in that period, Belial, but the Ahrimanic force is, they are exactly the same. And in fact, Ahriman, the term, of course, comes from the Persian religion. That's the Persian devil. Somehow, Steiner brought that forward as the name for this. That's quite amazing. And also separated Lucifer and Ahriman as two separate forces that humanity had to face off against. Very interesting. Indeed. And with that, Miss Olivia.
Okay, this was my original last question, so I'm going to throw it at you. Najat Madri says, Klaus Schwab claims there will be no elections, just algorithms of popularity. What are the odds of a 2024 election? What would be the reason? A, pandemic, B, climate change, C, aliens, or all of the above?
I think they're in a bind with the 2024 election because under traditional circumstances, they can't win it. And I don't think they can have the COVID op twice. I think that they can have other ops. I think they can try a COVID redux, but I don't think that they can push that forward. I think that it's going to be harder to fix the 2024 election. And there will be some fixing for sure, but it'd be much harder. The way that they were able to do it. You know, remember that they considered the continuity of government in going into COG in that October when they had Trump get COVID and all the rest of it. And I think that's the reason why Trump, after the fact, fires all these people, because I think that he's learned that they tried to pull this off. And I think they try to pull it off with Van Herk, and that's why he fires Esper after the election's over and he doesn't win. So yeah, there's all kinds of deep things to say there, but for sure, when it comes to the 2024 election, you've got a lot of truth out there through the figure of RFK Jr. carrying that flame of Camelot, and quite well, because this is not somebody who's just relying on his name. He's incredibly accomplished on his own, and the work that he's done against Monsanto and others, the incredible pharmaceutical engines, you know, they hate him the most. And there's a reason for that. The combination of Trump and Kennedy is absolutely unstoppable. But I think what you see them right now is vying for the heads of their respective parties. And it's going to be quite a showdown. That much I can assure you of. I had a quote for you since I mentioned Garrison earlier. And so I sometimes mention that in this book, if you have make lemonade, the Warren Hinkle biography, it's very interesting because he's around and he does a kind of version of Rolling Stone called Ramparts Magazine, which is absolutely the most powerful kind of political and revolutionary. And Garrison worked a lot with him, feeding him information. And so what Hinkle learns, and it's kind of interesting. Hinkle figures out that now that he talks to Garrison, he's getting followed everywhere. And his life starts to become very difficult because people are following him. He's being interfered in. There's a break-in at his office. You know, it's all kinds of stuff, but only since he met Garrison. There's definitely a connection there. Garrison had that effect, which is they were really on his tail. And so he starts to call him, and you know, he's avoiding his calls and all the rest. And so Hinkle is hiding out in this mailroom, and somehow Garrison gets the number of the mailroom, calls, and Hinkle picks up, and he's like, "Oh God, it's Garrison." And so this is what Garrison says to him. But keep in mind the records that are blocked on the JFK side, and then keep in mind what we've been telling you about aerospace here tonight. Okay. The caller was in no mood to inquire about the weather. This is urgent, Jim Garrison said. Can you take this in your mailroom? They'd never think to tap the mailroom extension. I excused myself to go to the mailroom for a moment on a matter of high priority and left the investor, sputtering like a referee without a whistle, alone with the latest negative balance sheets. In the mailroom, two bearded Berkeleyite mailboys were running the postage machine under the influence of marijuana. I told them to take a walk around the block and get high on company time and lock the door behind them. Garrison began talking when I picked up the mailroom extension. Quote, "This is risky, but I have little choice. It is imperative that I get this information to you now." This is 1968. It is imperative I get this information to you now. Important new evidence has surfaced. Those Texas oilmen do not appear to be involved in President Kennedy's murder in the way we first thought. It was the military-industrial complex that put up the money for the assassination, but as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. I've got the names of the three companies and their employees who were involved in setting up the president's murder. Do you have a pencil? I wrote down the names of the three defense contractors. Garrison identified them as Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics. And the names of those executives in their employ whom the district attorney said had been instrumental in the murder of Jack Kennedy. I also logged a good deal of information about a mysterious minister who was supposed to have crossed the border into Mexico with Lee Harvey Oswald shortly before the assassination. The man wasn't a minister at all, Garrison said, but an executive with a major defense supplier in clerical disguise. I knew little about ministers crossing into the Rio Grande with Oswald, but after several years of fielding the dizzying details of the Kennedy assassination from Garrison, I had learned to leave closed Pandora's boxes lie. I didn't ask. I said that I had everything down, and Garrison said a hurried goodbye. It's poor security procedure, true, to use the phone, but the situation warrants the risk. Get this information to Bill Turner. He'll know what to do with it. I wanted you to have this in case something happens. Garrison stumbled into the aerospace aspect of the Kennedy assassination. That's why his records are locked up. That's why the Joe and Nitty's records are locked up. That's the key to the JFK assassination, and it rings from the Kennedy meeting with Khrushchev relating to the UFO file through Reagan and Gorbachev, and then finally to Trump and Putin. That's what this is all about. And with that, Miss Olivia.
Okay. I have a
super
bunch of
chats.
super chatters
Thank
to
you.
thank. Gillenjoy R, Griffin Eagle 7, Bobo the Clown, DE, a cult fan, Annie Nelson Love, Stacy Conger, Eurythmia's Fun, Jay Parsons, WC Ray, Global Atlantis, Thomas Ball, Heidi Reynolds, Roosevelt Media News, KG, Ellison Ballard, Sun Hero, Doreen Hewitt, Lila, Robert Scott, Medley Childress, Dean Tant, Gabriel, Wolfgang McCarthy, Amarillo Gunrunners, Slow Time, Karen Carpenter, Michael Snow, Shazam, and Divine Divinity. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
That's fantastic. Divine Divinity. I like that. We really appreciate your support. It helps us to keep going here. And to all our subscribers and supporters, thank you. We couldn't do it without you. We will be back next week. There's some special reports coming up. Of course, the X series returns after Labor Day, but in the meantime, we have some incredible interviews coming up for you as well. Make sure you're signed up on that newsletter. If you haven't already, of course, at the site, sign up and become a subscriber and get access to all the incredible things we have coming up before anyone else, and stand up and be counted and get behind the work that we're doing here. And I'll do some shout outs here since we've got such a great, fantastic crowd tonight. Unbelievable. Roosevelt Media. It's great to see you, sir. Great show. Thank you very much. There is Dr. Joseph. Hey, look at this. I can't. There it is. Okay. Get them now directly from the publisher. I think if Joseph is talking about his new book, I am endeavoring to read that book shortly and then have you on to talk all about it. So let's talk about that ASAP. Great show, kids. Najat Madre. Yeah, I can't wait to read that too. Jennifer Walters, thank you. DJ and Olivia. Griffin Eagle. Wow. Elsa Barrett. Karen Carpenter. Excellent. Wayne Peak. A. Maria. Golden Girl. Says great ideas room. Love y'all. That's a Texas y'all for sure. Thank you, Joseph. It's great to see you out there. I found myself reading, and I have some quotes actually I'll save for the next show, but the Secret Space Program, Celestial Psyops, and Hidden Conflicts, Covert Wars Breakaway book from Dr. Farrell. Smoking hot with information, my goodness, and crucial. The timing is very interesting, and I find this with a lot of the work that I've been able to do that say something over the past like 7 or 8 years. A lot of the work that was going on in that period is coming to such incredible fruition now in the headlines every day that it's almost remarkable. It's like there was, among a great group of researchers tapping in, and then all this information came forward. Just absolutely remarkable. And Bardo Dapper DJ, thank you very much. Hilarious. This is just something I slipped on. Thomas Ball, read everything JP Farrell and Peter Dale Scott. You can't go wrong. The only problem is you'll be stuck for hours because you won't want to leave the material. I know that trip. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, thank you, sir. It's great to have you here. And Ross Thistle Artworks, excellent. Thomas Ball. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Martin Taylor, excellent. Yeah, exactly. And of course, we put Elon on notice. No X series through X. The X series is right here. So no imposters. Exactly. Dean Taunt. We don't want to leave you, DJ. Well, remember, it says end broadcast, but it never really ends.
Nope.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. And never let it be forgot, once there was Camelot. I have a lot more to get to here that I didn't get to. So that just means we have some good stuff for the next show. Remember what this handshake may have been really all about. And that's the nature of the problem that we've been having with our deep state and X-Protect related to the UFO file. That these great leaders in these great countries are trying to get together and go around this incredible block of the intelligence agencies and the sick, corrupt Central Intelligence Agency. So we will be back with you next week. Thank you so much, everyone. Donnie Rotten, Ivan Langley, Corey Anderson. And remember, everyone, to have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you soon.
God bless everybody.